Well, very grateful to Peru and colleagues at VCU for the opportunity to talk with you. And I'm really fascinated by what's been going on here. I think having been an early developer of a program that would be research oriented and teaching. Ours, in our case, was mainly grad students to begin, so we did only a graduate school. And but in energy and environment, I think it's really kind of interesting. My interest in doing this actually came from the IPCC, which for me was the best experience of an interdisciplinary, I mean, really interdisciplinary study on something. So I really thought that was, and we ended up in the beginning in the College of Engineering, following a model like at Carnegie Mellon of engineering and public policy. So I like the idea that you're trying to get the science, the engineering, and the social science in the room together and try and figure out how to talk through these issues. And that's what the IPCC is about. I don't see any way you solve this problem without getting all of that in there. Anyway, that's the background. Let me plug into. I'm supposed to sort of lean here on the a bit on the policy side, and I'll just give you the punchline from the beginning. I don't think our problem now, ask me 20 years from now, I'm going to show you, okay? I think we can meet some of the most aggressive standards we need to meet in the next 20 years. We have the science and the technology on the shelf. Here is the really interesting one. I'm a recovering economist. I've been at it for a long time, and economists have an amazing way of not counting important things. But anyway, if you just take prices as they are, we can also meet these opportunities with existing prices. So I don't think the problem is technology. I don't think the problem is economics. I do think the problem is the policy sector, not simply a policy, but the policy sector and what motivates it to search, search behavior to find an answer. That the policy sector is looking in all the wrong places now. And our problem is how to shift that policy sector. So that's the punchline of the talk. That's what I'm going to try. And I'm going to give you two examples of what it would mean to go searching in a new direction, which you may find, to be a little bit too wild and woolly, but anyway, such as it is. So in case you didn't remember this when you woke up this morning, you live in the most wealthy period economically of human civilization, by far. I mean, there isn't anything like what happened in the last 100 years or so compared to the last 500 years. We grew economically in ways that were, well, unparalleled, unknown to human civilization. That's an extraordinary gift. Not sure. I mean, I was born, but I mean, other than that, the thing was put together, the infrastructure was there. And yeah, you probably, or maybe since this is a climate change and a carbon conference, one, not all, but one of the drivers, okay, was also the rapid introduction of a carbon economy. That carbon economy facilitated. You can, once you get into path dependency, both things are interacting with each other. Who knows which one comes first? What you know is that the two have been traveling together for quite some time, okay? Rapid economic growth and rapid increase in the use of carbon fuels. Those two go together, okay? That's the one part of our legacy. Here's another one. One colleague was talking about billion-dollar storms. Just a billion-dollar storms is used in NOAA, NASA, and some others as a way to say weather events that are outside whatever you want to bracket it in, once in 100 years, whatever. These are the events that are supposed to be very rare, okay? We're now having billion-dollar events. They're coming decade on decade, okay? But what I think is rather interesting at this point is the richest society in the world now has to set aside in that growing economy roughly $100 billion every year to clean up through either the insurance companies or through government what are the results of these disasters. That's a leak completely out of the economy. It doesn't do anything new for us. It simply means that we got to clean up after the storms hit, okay? 16 years, $1.6 trillion. Nobody can afford this. This is a form of madness, and we have to find a way to get out of this. And as you have heard from this conference, so I'm just going to give you one little additional piece to understand. And you can't do it the way you got here. That is, you can't get out of this problem by staying with the existing economic system that we have and with the existing fuel system. Everybody understands that at one level, but I just thought I'd put a, ping on it for you, okay? So some physicists were asked through the IPCC, how much storage space do we have for carbon? Given, if we're trying to do 2 degrees C as our cap, okay, how much remaining storage space is there in the atmosphere, given that it accumulates and it takes time to wash out? You put the carbon molecule up in the air, it may take 50 to 200 years for it to get washed, right? So how much space we got left? You don't have to know big, crazy numbers that some of this. We got roughly, if you're lucky, 1,000 gigatons of space. We have roughly 11,000 gigatons of fossil fuel. Now, that also tells you why we're going to have a problem changing things. That 11,000 tons of carbon is worth, today's prices, roughly $27 trillion. So if you want to figure out what the resistance is to change, you can see it, okay? On the other hand, we have no choice. I mean, I don't think, there shouldn't be a debate over, well, we're going to borrow, some other planet's atmosphere. I mean, where are we going to get the additional atmosphere to make room for anything like what we've been on? It doesn't exist. We cannot continue down this route. So my point, I don't think the problem is technology, though. I know this is a serious problem. It is very difficult to solve, but in the next 10 to 20 years where we have to hit targets, I think we already have much of the technology. I don't think it's economics. I'm going to show you why right away, okay? Having said that, coming from a university community, from an interdisciplinary, I love this kind of stuff. I am not suggesting that we downsize R&D by any stretch, because 20 years from now, we're going to need a whole lot of additional help, okay? So I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting, though, is we cannot use an excuse that we don't have the tools or that it's just too expensive. That is flat out false. If you bin all of the technologies that compete for energy service, and you bin them on the basis of what long ago invented in the utility industry a metric called levelized cost of energy. So levelized cost of energy, you figure out how long your technology is going to last, 20 years, 50 years, whatever it is. You put in how much energy it's going to generate, put that in the denominator. In the numerator, put the capital cost, put the borrowing cost, put the all the variable costs of every kind, put it in the numerator, and then compare today. Current prices in the United States, which is not paying all of the costs of the natural gas that it's pulling out. Natural gas clears the energy market. That's the lowest cost option in electricity at this point, okay, used by the utility industry, except we have 2 options in energy efficiency and in, someone said about how solar was that's true. People don't believe it, but that's true, okay? Solar competes very well against natural gas, and energy efficiency cleans its clock. We have the ability to use technologies that are already available to us, and when we do it, it's not going to cost us an arm and a leg. What we don't have is the motivation, the guidance, the planning system that sets in motion that direction. So this maybe should come to you as sort of obvious at one level. I don't know if it really does when I hear some of the political discussions going on. Our policy paradigm, okay, searches for path-dependent solutions. It's set up to use the current and the recent past as the benchmark against which you measure progress. That's it. If the utility regulator is looking to see whether you should be moving and buying more power or you should be buying more efficiency, they will look at what the current prices look like or the recent regulatory decisions that were made, okay, on that pricing. That's all going to be the data that we have currently. That's a path-dependent solution. It's built upon what we are already doing. You can't expect that policy paradigm to say, hey, here's a cool idea that's outside the path dependency, and we're going to go down in this new direction, and we're going to then make things better. That's not the way you would find it. You're going to have to shift the policy paradigm away from what is its current mode. For example, most utility regulation, I think I'm sorry, but the colleague from Sierra Club pointed out that the law, okay, is that the utilities get rates of return that are guaranteed. Those guaranteed rates of return mean that they are built around growth, not built around finding an alternative. They don't have to compete for this alternative because they're guaranteed, okay? We're not going to find the transformative thinking we need by going that way. It's sort of like finding a new destination for yourself by looking constantly through the rearview mirror to find out where you've been, okay? That is essentially the policy paradigm that we are in now. We need to shift to a different policy paradigm. What would that policy paradigm look like? This is not a perfect description, but I just want to give you what would be the fundamental difference in paradigm and how we then gauge decision-making in this manner. Now, this is as I said, I'm a recovering economist. This is a wonderful exhibit of the power of economic thinking. You have a two-axis plane. There isn't a number on either axis. Okay. But you know what the measurement, what the message is, okay? That's economists, in my opinion. I'm saying that because I spent a lot of time with engineers who I drove them crazy if I tried to say, well, why don't you just draw up that stress equation analysis and tell me, okay? And don't put any numbers on either axis. So yeah, anyway, that's what it is. So sustainable would mean that we actually would recognize a stop sign. That would be a physical limit. We would actually adhere to the physical limit. The physical limit is fairly well known now, thanks to the work of IPCC and others. But we know what is the limit on how much we can continue down this path of carbon economy. So you would slow it down. In this case, because we've taken too long, we now actually have to lower. This is an argument that John Peasy made to the World Bank back in 1992. He struggled with the World Bank to convince them that they had to stop simply preaching growth for growth's sake and instead building what would be a sustainable economy. But that's where we are. This thing probably, because of we've overshot already, we'd have to have this come down a little bit. But in any case, we know what it looks like. It's not optimizing growth. It's instead placing a priority on the health of our ecosystems and on the health of society. That's what we need to do. We have an additional standard that we have to meet. This is a standard that my colleagues and I wrote back in, how long ago was that? Well, 1998, yeah. Anyway, we did it first in 1998, and it's been cited a lot in IPCC and others since then, okay? And what we did was we figured out against the carrying capacity of the planet, how much could the planet absorb in CO2 that we release? How much could we store temporarily in the atmosphere? And then how much could we allocate on the basis of a per capita number that we built for 1990, which was the year in which the IPCC set the standard that we'd measure movement against. That was the baseline. And the answer is 3.3 tons per person per year. You can then multiply a country's population by that. If the population increases, your problem gets worse. It's not going to solve anything, okay, for getting. So 3.3 tons, the US is probably still the most carbon intensive major country in the world. We use way too much carbon per capita. We're in around 16 tons. If you were to draw this graph as we did 10 years ago, China would be below, but now it's above that metric. And the width of the bars, incidentally, is the proportion of world population. Okay, so we have to solve a problem of getting everybody to participate, in which there are a small number of countries that are way over budget on what their releases are against countries that have yet to have that kind of development. So we're going to have to solve not only a problem of sustainability, but we're going to have to solve a problem that doesn't allow this kind of disproportionate use of the atmosphere to store carbon waste by some countries and not others. Okay, so that's what we have to do. All right. Ugh, no problem. Let me suggest to you two images of what a sustainable and just development model would look like. That I think is what we need to do much more research on than what we've been doing in the past. So to do this, I'm going to take you to New York City. Can't put the whole of New York City on here for this particular part of the visualization. This is the lower end of Manhattan. And there is a resource in the city that is currently not being used, but could be used as a method to move us from high carbon to low carbon, okay? What we did was we organized a large LiDAR database, a drone-based remote sensing of every building in the city, roughly 1 million buildings plus roughly 4 billion data points to say precisely what does the building area, and particularly the rooftops, look like for the city of New York. So, I mean, this is what we do. We're crazy, but we love doing this work, okay? And we put through shading filters. We put through age of the roofs. We put through whether the roof, so if they were old, they may not be able to carry the weight of what we're after here is going to be. I don't own any solar stock. I'm not here to sell you solar panels, okay? That's not my purpose. I'm simply going to analyze for you what is our capability today with off-the-shelf technology to get us out of the need for carbon, okay? That's my destination on this particular. We put in angle of roof, the whole 9 yards, okay? And we simulated what would be the energy output from a rooftop solar system that was code compliant, so that you could move around on the roof and do the things that you need to do according to code. We ended up with a roughly 30% to 40% of the roof area of the city, okay, that could be used for this particular experiment. And it looks like this. The blue bars are the hour on hour in May and in August. They are the hour on hour loads of electricity demand in the city. It's based upon a 30-year profile of how the city has grown its load over time. And so we simply put to work the two technologies that I'm saying we can already use. We already know that they can compete in the market. I'm going to get to that in just a minute more. We started with what is a kind of standard when engineering companies come into, for example, campuses like this, they normally look at an ability to get roughly 20 to 30% of the electricity load down by simply upgrading the building technology, and it will pay for itself in something less than 7 years. So reasonable investment, okay? You can come in, you can do it. So if you did that for the city of New York on these 2 months, that's what it looks like, okay? Now we're going to move to the use of the roof areas, okay? First place you might do is public buildings, because public buildings have an ability to borrow in the municipal bond market. This may not be your cup of tea, but the municipal bond market is the lowest cost method of financing projects. That's why if you want to do water projects, you want to do bridge projects, you want to do anything major, you go through a municipal entity in order to get this done, okay? And we're going to do the same thing to begin by using the municipal, the public buildings, the schools, the hospitals, the offices that are public offices and so on. In New York, we had a designation for all of those buildings, okay, of what category they belonged in. And you get a roof area, something like that, that reduces your load by that amount. You'll see that you start to see the beginnings of a leveling of the load. Now, if you introduce the commercial building sector into this next, something happened that I have to say, when we did it in the beginning, we've done this now in 9 major cities in the world with very similar results, but we didn't expect this the first time. Wait for it. Yeah. Between the hours of 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. in the summer months, New York can export electricity from its new distributed solar power plant. Would that make any sense? Roughly, in New York, building owners pay between 12 and 16 cents a kilowatt hour. And before the Biden administration new very helpful additional incentives, you would pay roughly 12 cents with the earlier incentives to put these things on the roof. You have to build the project at a scale. You have to use public financing in order to do this. This is today. This isn't, we're waiting for a new technology that will arrive. We used 16% efficient cells. There was discussion here at the, I think we were somewhere north of 22% or something like that is what the new, we didn't use anything that pushed the edge. We didn't use any of that, okay? We simply tried to use what would be a feasible project. Obviously, it's a big construction project, so maybe you'll question me on that feasibility. But if we're trying to hit something like 40% or 50% by 2030, and you think New York will never make it, you're wrong, okay? There is an ability to do it. The question is whether we are going to redirect our policy purpose, our policy sector, to make urban plans of this kind come into being. It won't help you to look in the rearview mirror to figure out why we're not doing it. You have to figure out how to make this happen. We need a new policy direction where we work on how to do this rather than how to prevent it, which is what we largely have right now. Okay, if you do that, this is what, by neighborhood, this is what the result will look like. The green areas are areas where you're at 50% of load being served by all hours on average, okay? What we did was, this does expect that you can pull in the evening. Obviously, when there's no solar, you can pull grid power, but then you have to pay for that grid power. Okay, so this doesn't change anything against what it is now, okay? So the green is where you're 50%, the dark green is where you're approaching 100%. And the red and the yellow is where you're only cutting a small portion of your demand. There's one borough in New York that's gonna have a problem. It's the borough you'd expect. I mean, this is not, okay? But there's other boroughs. Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, 4 boroughs. This is where the income of New York is often below the median or the mean. These are the communities that would have surpluses, especially during summer hours, okay, would have surpluses that would allow them to actually sell power. That's a change in the way in which we would think about the electricity system, that you would actually now have an ability to make possible those communities that are creating the surpluses would now be able to receive in some manner the benefits of this kind of program. That's a different way in which you would organize the utility service than what we have now. I'm going to show you in just a minute, there is an alternative, but it actually is long ago. Originally, cities ran the electric utility system. They were publicly owned entities and they ran it, okay? If you want to get somewhere near, you've got everybody now wanting to participate. Imagine what the vote looks like if you ask the green areas, would you like to participate in this project? There's a chance you're going to get support, okay? A lot of public support for something like this, okay? But you'd have to create a new system, a new policy sector that would allow for this transfer to take place. This is one of my favorite new ones. So I only got one more to go, okay? This is Emily Grubert. She was at Georgia Tech, competed away to Notre Dame, civil engineering, and policy analysis. I like this kind of stuff. Okay. She's come up with this interesting approach. We retire all of the plants. We retire the plants at the point where our ability to produce through existing off-the-shelf renewable energy technology and energy efficiency technology would be able to cover the point. So this is her original graph. It's in Science. It's a beautiful paper. You can go and get her database right out of the paper. It's really, really kind of cool. And anyway, what she's looking for is a fossil fuel phase out with an energy efficiency and renewable energy phase in. You can see the points cross at roughly 2032. This is built on the US scale. I did New York City for you. She's done now on the US scale. She didn't do all the buildings like I did, but I mean, my team did, not me. I don't do that anymore. My team does it. Anyway, so the big issue is to get the integration plan to make this happen. And that's what I think we should be doing a lot more of than what we are now working on. We are working in an area that's not helping us to understand the opportunity if we do it at the scale that we now need to accomplish. Our problem is we have a big scale problem, but if we try to fix the big scale problem with little nibbles here or there and everywhere, we may never find a real solution. We have to scale to the problem, and we then have to figure out how to make it work, okay? That's what I mean by instead of rear view mirror, looking forward. And the last step I will say, because there's been discussion on California, so I put this one in. Roughly in California now, well, certainly in Pacific gas and electric territory, that's one of the biggest utilities in the United States, never mind in California. They have now given up trying to regulate and supply energy efficiency and renewable energy service. Those services, renewable energy and energy efficiency, are now managed by what you could call the original municipal utility model. This is an example of one of them, okay? This is the Marin Choice Energy. This is real. It's existed for about 5 years now. About 540,000 accounts are run under this. The lower end of the product that you buy from them is 60% renewable. You can pay a little more and you can get 100% renewable that comes from California, and you can pay 100% and have it all locally solar produced. All three of their products beat the price of Pacific Gas and Electric. That is, the incumbent utility cannot sell this alternative, okay, in the way that this. Now, as I say, these folks have an advantage. This is a capital move here that we're making, and they can borrow capital at a very, very low rate, okay, unlike what private sector will borrow, okay? So, but there is a way to get to this. The 540,000 accounts took roughly 4 years for these 4 counties and 36 cities to build. That's fast. So that's my thought to you. 2 thought experiments. I'm not sure. I just thought there you go. Thank you very much. Yes, I was hoping. I was waiting.
There is another version of $100 billion per year, right?
That's right.
Disaster thing.
100 billion.
100 billion.
Yeah.
There are politicians or business people say it's a good opportunity to make us money.
Yes, I'm sorry.
It is good opportunity to make us money.
That's correct.
So they say it's a good business opportunity. So we should not be complaining about it.
I'm sorry. We don't want to complain about it.
Yeah, because it's encourages construction workers, construction materials gets used, right?
I'm missing your, I can't hear so well.
But that is another part of the business world.
Oh, I see what you're saying now. Yeah.
They think it's an opportunity,
Yeah. Yeah.
business opportunity.
Do you
Since you had
think,
economists
do you
are
think you
asking-
could find a better use of that $100 billion than sweeping the floor and vacuuming out the water?
Yeah.
Okay.
But construction workers from the north, they all go to Florida.
I'm not saying, you know that you could create the many jobs and you can. Anyway, sorry. I've been waiting for you.
Thank you, John. That's it.
Yeah.
The next speaker is Tasha Lewinsky, an associate professor and graduate program director of chemical and life sciences engineering at VCU. She has focused her career on integrating biological and environmental compatibility into the design process of engineering nanomaterials. Her research interests include nanotechnology, nanoinformatics, sustainable nanotechnology, and comparative in vitro, in vivo analyses. Title of her talk, as you see, nanotechnology for coral reef resilience.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'd like to thank Guru Jenna, as well as the ISEE community here for this opportunity today to share with you some of the research that my group has been doing here at VCU. And as was introduced, I'm a nano nerd, so you're going to learn a little bit about nanotechnology. Is it not working? I can try to speak louder. Okay. Okay, is that better? All right. Hi. So how many of you have visited a coral reef before? Awesome. Well, if you haven't, don't worry, because I haven't yet myself, although I look forward to doing it. And so this photo shows an image of a coral reef in Florida. And this rock-like structure that you see here is built by the coral animals. And it fosters, it serves as a home essentially for many marine creatures, and therefore fosters the rich biodiversity of the ocean. And coral reefs also serve as a natural infrastructure. So they protect our coasts and support fisheries. So you see all the fish here, as well as tourism. So, you know, the scuba diving is very popular, as well as a lot of jobs. And so this is where coral reefs are suffering from increased stress due to more frequent disturbances. And this is where there's an urgency to assist corals in resistance to, as well as recovery from these disturbances. And so a few years ago, my group actually started looking into ways in which we could harness nanotechnology to protect corals. And while we aim for these technologies to someday translate to the ocean, we study these corals actually in aquaria in the laboratory. And so here on the left, I show you an experimental setup that's currently in my lab, where we are growing fragments of the coral animals. And we are specifically looking at a species called Poeciloptera damicornis, which you see here on the right. And so these are small polyp stony or scleractinian corals. So they are reef building corals. They calcify their skeletons. And so this image here shows you NOAA's Coral Reef Watch. And the areas that you see in color are where the sea surface temperatures are either warmer or cooler than the long-term average. And so with prolonged warmer temperatures, then corals experience an accumulated heat stress. And so then this heat stress can lead to triggering of coral bleaching. And coral bleaching is a process where the symbiotic algae that live in the coral tissue. So here on the left, you see a photo of a healthy coral where the symbiotic algae are inside the tissue, and those algae are exchanging food for shelter with the corals. And when that symbiotic relationship is broken down, then the algae can be released from the coral. And so you see in this bleached photo of a coral in the center that the pigmentation is lost and the white color of the aragonite skeleton beneath the tissue is clearly visible. And so there are different mechanisms in which the algae could be lost from the coral tissue, the exocytosis, maybe autophagy. And one of the mechanisms behind this loss of the algae is thought to be increased reactive oxygen species generation by the algae inside the coral tissues. And so we hypothesized that there are nanoparticles that have been developed in the biomedical field. So particularly the ones that my group had experience with is Syria nanoparticles, and they have unique redox properties and can serve as an antioxidant material. So what we were proposing is to then deliver these ROS scavenging Syria nanoparticles to the corals to scavenge the ROS that's generated in a way to mitigate the coral bleaching or this breakdown in the symbiotic event. So here I show you that we synthesized a polymer-coated Syria nanoparticle. And this transmission electron microscopy image here shows you the roughly 4 nanometer diameter particles. And when we disperse them in artificial seawater, we saw that they were, the stability and the size distribution was relatively stable and maintained. And when, looking across different dispersants, so in the distilled water, the marine broth, which is where we culture the symbiotic algae cells, or the artificial seawater, the particles maintain a negative zeta potential, which is important to keep that dispersion. And so then we started by testing if the elevated reactive oxygen species generation is coming from the symbiotic algae. Then we chose to work with one species called Rivolium minutum. And here I show you confocal images of the algae. You see the bright field and the fluorescence images where when the algae are not exposed to our Syria nanoparticles, and the Syria is not fluorescence itself, but when we coated the particles with polymer, we had incorporated a fluorescent dye, specifically DII, so that we could track them in the cells. And so when these images in the bottom right are showing that when we do expose the symbiotic algae to these fluorescently labeled nanosyria, that they do get internalized within 30 minutes. And you can see the fluorescence here where the magenta color is indicating where the nanoparticles are located in the cells, and the green again is showing the chlorophyll fluorescence from the chloroplasts in the algae. And so we wanted to verify that these particles were compatible with the algae cells. And so when we measured the growth of the cells over time, then the growth rate was relatively unchanged, up to 0.5 micrograms per milliliter concentrations of Syria. And so then when we did the dosing experiments, we chose a concentration that was below that 0.5. So when we dosed the algae with 0.3 milligrams or micrograms per milliliter of Syria, then we saw that the extent of reactive oxygen species generation was reduced under both normal temperature conditions, so the 27 degrees Celsius, as well as elevated or heat stress conditions, so this 34 degrees Celsius. And so here you see under those two temperature conditions, the reactive oxygen, intracellular reactive oxygen species levels in the algae for the negative control, so just the algae at those two temperatures. When we added the positive control for Ross, it was hydrogen peroxide. And then when we dosed the cells with the ceria, and we were mitigating then the heat stress that you see this elevated Ross with the higher temperature, you see this mitigation with the presence of the ceria. And so this gave us some confidence that this method shows some promise, in which case then we don't intend to necessarily propose that we just dump nanoparticles into ocean if this is a promising potential nanomedicine. So we explored the idea of using the algae that have been shown to, in this case, the Brevolium minutum have been shown to actually reinfect a sea anemone. So it's a Cnidaria, it's a model species that is used commonly to represent Cnidaria in the corals. A lot of reef building like this scleractinian corals also are in that same kingdom, in which case then this Exaptasia pelata, or commonly known as Aptasia, is a sea anemone where you can find it in both a symbiotic state, so this is where the algae are inside the tissue, or in an aposymbiotic state where there is no algae. So we had chosen then to load our symbiotic algae with the nanoceria and then deliver the nanoceria loaded algae to the aposymbiotic anemones to show this as a potential cellular-based delivery mechanism. And so if you're familiar with how T-cell delivery is being proposed for cancer treatment, this is a mirroring or analogy of that approach, just in corals. And so when we inoculated these aposymbiotic algae with the nanoparticle containing symbiotic algae, 1 week post inoculation, we saw successful reinfection of the algae into those anemones. And so here I show you a fluorescence confocal microscopy image where the red dots are showing the chlorophyll fluorescence and thus demonstrating the presence of the algae inside the anemone tissue, and a majority of it is in the tentacle structures of the anemone. And this chlorophyll fluorescence was absent in the anemones that were before they were inoculated with the algae. And to ensure that the ceria was also being delivered as the algae were reinfecting the anemones, we used laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectroscopy to verify that there is the presence of ceria. So we had laser ablated spots in the tentacles as well as in the column wall of the anemones, and found that. So here we have our standards. We use NIST standards to show the negative or absence of ceria as well as in the positive, and it goes beyond the axes of this chart, but we found high concentrations of ceria, or higher rather, in the treated anemone tentacles, still some presence of ceria in the column wall, and these were higher than the untreated anemones. So that gave us confidence that yes, not only are they being reinfected, but also the ceria nanoparticles are being delivered with them. And so this is work that we aim to continue to look at and move from the anemones to then reef building corals such as Acroporas and other species that could be studied. So more recently, we've started studying coral wound healing, and a major indicator of coral health is the amount of live coral cover. And so here on the left side, you see images of coral reefs in Key Largo, Florida, that have been showing, you see the visual decline of the coral cover, and then globally, there's been a reporting decline over the years. However, microfragmentation, or the breaking up of large coral colonies into smaller fragments, has been shown repeatedly, and you see in this table for several different coral species, to accelerate coral tissue growth. And it's being used in restoration efforts to cover artificial reef structures. And so you see here in this bottom right image where they had adhered small fragments of corals onto the artificial reef structure. And within a year, the entire structure was completely covered with coral tissue. And so this microfragmentation approach leverages the wound healing process. And so partnering with my colleagues, Angela and Rebecca Siegel, and Angela Reynolds, sorry, and Rebecca Siegel in the math department, we are building mathematical models to predict the rate of coral wound healing. And so we are collecting data to measure those wound healing rates. And here I show you two different types of wounds. So here's a circular wound that we had induced with a biopsy punch in the corals, as well as here is a linear wound. And we're trying to understand how the difference in the perimeter and the surface area of the wounds affects the wound healing rate. And so this is an active project, and our initial model is showing very good results for these two shapes of wounds in the coral Poeciloptera damicornis. And we are working to extend this differential equation model to predict wound healing outcomes when chemicals such as nanoparticles are introduced to the corals. And we're also interested in understanding the cells that are coming into the wounded space. And so we're using particles to track that. And in the center image, you see then the coral cells that have taken up these fluorescent polystyrene beads. And we're trying to use that phagocytic property to differentiate between different coral cells. And finally, we're also in the process of exploring the effectiveness of polylactic coglycolic or PLGA nanoparticles to serve as carriers to deliver drugs. And we have a hypothesis that we could deliver drugs to accelerate the wound healing process. And so here I show you a TM image of the PLGA particles we've synthesized in my lab. And when we disperse them in artificial seawater, they have a similar particle size as measured by DLS between PBS and the artificial seawater, so that higher salinity environment wasn't necessarily affecting the particle size. And they're relatively stable. The size doesn't change too much across 5 days of suspension in the seawater. And we've also then been verifying that these particles do not cause adverse effects in the corals. And we've shown that the drug-loaded PLGA particles, at least when we look at the pigmentation, the tissue cover, and the responsiveness of the corals does not change. And we've also designed some fluidic devices to help us perform these dosing experiments that we are working on to understand the effectiveness of these drugs. And so lastly, all of these studies that I've talked about, the two, whether it be the bleaching mitigation or the wound healing, were conducted in vivo, and a majority of coral research that's being done is conducted in vivo. And if we want to quickly assess the safety of potential medicines or other chemicals of concern in corals, then we need more high throughput methods. And so we need in vitro models. And so we're in the process of developing stable coral cell cultures from coral cells that are dissociated from coral fragments. And so here you see a bright field image with fluorescence overlaid, and that's where the endogenous fluorescence from the corals, whether it be the chlorophyll from the algae or the different fluorescent proteins, shows. And here you see the algae plus these nematocysts that are present in coral cells. So we characterize the endogenous fluorescence. So you see here you see the tryptophan, the cyan, green, and red fluorescent proteins plus the chlorophyll signature. And again, to screen for safety, we want to have a method to test for whether the cells are remaining viable or not. And so this is commonly done using fluorescent dyes that take advantage of whether or not they're permeable to the cell membrane. And so we assessed 5 either live or all cell fluorescent stains, as well as 6 dead stains to determine a pair that could determine the viability of the cells and worked around the endogenous fluorescence of the corals. And so the pair that we identified was this host 33342 and the cytox orange. As you see here, they have minimal interference from the endogenous fluorescence. And this is a representative image where you see here the chlorophyll and the GFP signatures from the cells themselves, and then are all in dead stain here. And so we applied this to then study different molecules. We chose insulin because a remote homology approach demonstrated that corals have an insulin receptor. And we wanted to see if there was a way that we could understand its role in the symbiotic relationship. We also chose titania because it is an ingredient in mineral sunscreens, and there's a lot of concern about the impact of sunscreens on coral reefs. And so using our in vitro cytotoxicity tests, we were able to determine lethal concentration 50s for these two molecules. And insulin is novel, but with the titania, there have been other studies that have shown that they see some bleaching effects in Acropora and Montestrea at concentrations around 10 micrograms per milliliter. So this corroborates, or our results corroborate with those in vivo findings as well. And to give you a sense of what the environmental concentrations are, at some locations, it's been measured in beaches. So then the concentration of titania is attributed to beachgoers being present in those waterways. Then the range of titania has been measured between 0.007 micrograms per liter, as well as up to 0.9 micrograms per liter. And so those are orders of magnitude smaller than the concentrations we've measured. And also keep in mind that we are doing high dose, short-term acute toxicity tests here. And we also, this is again verifying, we went back to our Syria nanoparticles from the original study and verified that up to concentration, several orders of magnitude than the one we had used to demonstrate the raw scavenging, that at least in vitro, there's minimal reduction in cell viability. And so the Syria and the PLGA nanoparticles are just two examples of ways in which we could potentially harness nanotechnology to protect corals. And we could think about other ideas such as developing nanoparticles to serve as a sunscreen for corals. We could develop nanoparticles to serve as sensors, unique sensors to measure, say, lipids or temperature or pH in the coral tissue. And so there's many nano biotechnologies we could imagine that we could apply to, again, monitor, transform the way we are currently monitoring, conserving, preserving, and restoring our corals. And we're going to need a large team of researchers to do this sooner rather than later. And so I'm really looking forward to growth in this research community. So I'd like to thank all of the amazing students that have helped me in the lab. Particularly, I'd like to thank my former postdoc, who is now an assistant professor at Arizona State University, Lisa Roger, who helped me launch this research in my lab. And I've had wonderful collaborators and has been fortunate to have this work supported by the National Science Foundation, as well as VCU's Accelerate Fund, which I'm very thankful for their support. And I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you for your attention.
For a quick question.
What does it take for experimentation like this to come up with when you've said, okay, this is a positive result, we see what the application is, to think about, or what are the barriers to being able to scale and use what you're doing, you know, in a broader function?
We are currently trying to partner with practitioners, so people that are actually going to sites to restore the reefs, to better understand that process, so that we can, you know, this is where we're early on, and we can then design the delivery mechanisms that could be more easily facilitated through their own process. And then in that way, we hopefully accelerate then that translation. But again, engineered nanomaterials, there's some concern about introduction into the environment. And so that's again where we want to take a responsible approach and have been also connecting with folks to look at ways we could kind of scale the testing and think about, we've tested in small aquaria, can we go to mesocosms that simulate the ocean and then give us some proof of concept data. So we've actually been starting collaborations with folks in the biosphere to ocean to think about that as a workflow. Yes. Go ahead.
So I'm just curious, would you see a difference in your Syria if you use a trivalent versus a tetravalent?
So we haven't explored different sizes, different shapes. We borrowed the formulation of the Syria that has been demonstrated to show ROS quenching in plants, actually. So we've translated that. And it's also, like I mentioned before, Syria has been extensively studied for biomedical applications. So that's where too, though, yes, the crystallinity, the shape, the size can affect the effectiveness of the ROS scavenging and also the direction of the redox, I would say, or the prevalence. So those are things that we still need to explore further.
We'll hold the questions until.
Okay.
Thank you.
you.
This next speaker is Dr. Stephen Fong. He's professor of chemical and life sciences engineering at VCU. In addition, he's also the director of the Integrated Life Sciences doctoral program. Steve's research area focuses on microbial engineering using systems and synthetic biology techniques. And he also runs an undergraduate research team that works on local sustainable issues.
Thank you. Hoping it's done now.
Seems to take a minute or two.
Hello? Okay, guys. There. Hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. All right. Thanks. And thanks for the opportunity to close this session with the last talk. I'm going to have a chance to talk to you a little bit about some biotechnology. As our first speaker was saying, like the technology is there. So some of what I want to talk about is some of the existing things that we do that are available right now, and a little bit about how some of this technology can actually be used to address like longer term issues that might arise. So to me as an engineer, this problem is a really simple one. You have inputs, you have outputs, and in the middle of that, you have a process. So for me, from an engineering standpoint, the inputs that we talk about is I want to be able to think about biotechnology from a sustainable perspective. So the inputs that we think about is like, hey, things that are normally waste products. So things that you would be normally going to landfill, things that are very cheap, disposal, like things that are currently causing some ancillary problems, those could actually be inputs into our processes. Outputs could be a whole number of things. So for this, we're talking about, hey, you can make fuels, you can make energy as an output. I'm also a chemical engineer, so I can also think about chemicals. Can we replace the chemical industry by making chemicals in a biotech fashion from something that is a cheap, renewable, sustainable input? And then the middle ground here is this, the process. This to me is what we design. This is the engineering part. We use different organisms from a biotech standpoint to enable the conversion from different inputs to different outputs. So a classic is the biofuels thing where we say, hey, I could use cellulose as a starting, try to get a fuel, a drop-in fuel, and we want to be able to have an organism in the middle here that does that. Can I just feed straight switchgrass or something cellulosic biomass into an organism and just one shot have it converted into a fuel? Yes, you can. So this is kind of what I want to illustrate to you guys with in a couple different stories. Real quick, I'll just go through it, surveying it. Really, the crux of this problem, though, when we try doing this from a biotech standpoint, is there's this background debate that goes on. Do we use a model organism or do we use a non-model organism? And so this fundamental discussion, when we think about model organisms, we're talking about like yeast, E. coli, stuff that we've been studying in labs for all these years. We use those because they're well characterized. We know a lot of information about them. We've developed tools over the years to be able to use these organisms. And the big downside is these have limited native function, right? So yes, you can use E. coli to do a whole bunch of things, but natively it's not going to do a whole bunch for you. So you have to actually import a lot of function into it to get it to do these novel, fun things. Non-model organisms are things like, oh, somebody went to a hydrothermal vent in the ocean and found this unique species that has never been discovered before. Hey, maybe it does some interesting things. Can we utilize those interesting things to our advantage? The problem is we don't really understand them very well, these non-model organisms. We don't have tools to work with them, but maybe we can find one of those organisms. Like a couple of years ago, they found one and it breaks down plastic. So we can use that unique function and can we do something with it? So there's this trade-off. Do we use non-model organisms? Do we use model organisms, right? And in this era, a lot of people try and take and borrow from the non-model organisms and dump it into a model organism. But I'll also tell you that doesn't always work well. That's almost like saying, hey, I'm going to take this engine out of a Lamborghini and drop it into a Honda Civic and expect that it's going to work, right? Doesn't always work as expected. So I was going to give you a couple snapshots of a couple different non-model organisms, tell you how we work with it, what some of the challenges are, and just give you a perspective real quick, walking through a couple. First is Clostridium thermocellum. This is an organism that takes cellulose and it produces ethanol or hydrogen from it. Okay, this was a high-profile organism originally targeted by the DOE when biofuels was a thing. So we started working on this. The really interesting thing about Clostridium thermocellum is it has these little nodules here. On the outside of its cell membrane, it produces these nodules. These nodules are its cellulitic system. It breaks down cellulose and it localizes all of the cellulitic components into a nodule on the outside of the membrane that efficiently breaks down cellulose. This was a unique thing. So you can't just take and borrow those and dump it into E. coli and expect it's going to make these nodules that efficiently break down cellulose. There's a reason why you want to work with Clostridium thermocellum. So my background as an engineer, one of the things that we first did for this was we created a mathematical model for this to just try and describe what are all the things that it actually does. So this is in the genomic era. We have all of its genetic information. We know all the genes that are present in it. So we can model all of that, all of its capabilities, put it together. We can figure out that there's about 432 genes that we can account for and all the associated reactions. Furthermore, this interesting thing of the cellulosome that actually breaks down the cellulose can count for up to 20% of its cell mass. And if we look at the protein content there, we can model that as well. So now we have the ability to computationally model how do we break down cellulose and what does it do as a consequence. And the consequence is there's a trade-off. It produces ethanol or it produces hydrogen. If we look at ethanol production and hydrogen production, there's a trade-off. This organism natively, if it produces a lot of ethanol, produces very little hydrogen. If it produces a lot of hydrogen, it produces very little ethanol. So this is one of the first things we were able to identify by just modeling this organism, figuring out what its capabilities were. So, at first, at this time, a lot of people were interested in producing ethanol. This has probably shifted now. We're more interested in hydrogen. But you can see that there's a trade-off between these two. And we can actually predict that and figure out how to optimize or maximize one versus the other. When we were first doing this, the interest was in producing more ethanol, right, to supplement gasoline. So what we could also do by modeling this is we could go through and we could look at every gene and we could say, hey, if we remove certain genes, or if we modify this organism, can we increase the amount of ethanol it would produce? So here what we're showing is this is an unmodified Clostridium thermocellum. And on the y-axis is the range of ethanol that it would produce. So an unmodified Clostridium thermocellum produces a very little bit of ethanol. By simulating this and running and seeing what happens if we modify it, each one of these is a different gene that we could remove. And just by removing a single gene, all of a sudden we can force an increase in the amount of ethanol that it produces. Okay? We go through and look at this and say, hey, does this actually make sense biochemically? So we're just corresponding, like this acetate kinase is found right here. So red corresponds with red. This NADH oxidoreductase is over here. And what do we see? It's intuitive. If we remove some of the competing byproducts like acetate, we get more ethanol production. Okay, great. What about these other two, the blue and the green that actually produce more ethanol? These are both involved with hydrogen production. Like I said, there's a trade-off between ethanol and hydrogen. It's redox balancing, right? You produce more of one, you get less of the other. So this led us to something where we could target exactly which genes to actually force either more ethanol or more hydrogen production. Computationally, you can predict all this. We could actually verify this with how the organism functions by doing some RNA sequencing, gene expression studies. So we could look at the genes and how much the different genes are actually expressed natively in the organism. So we can know really, hey, is this going to have an effect if we remove that gene? And then unfortunately, that's where we stopped with this organism. Why? Well, this is a strict anaerobe. If you've ever worked with strict anaerobes, they're difficult to work with. And as I said, with non-model organisms, they don't have a lot of tools. So you also couldn't actually experimentally knock the genes out. So we couldn't even verify this because tools weren't there. So that made us switch organisms. Here's another non-model organism, Thermobiphyta fusca. This one, we tried to work with cellulose as a starting point, tried to get to propanol, a better liquid fuel. The reason why we switched to this, it's aerobic. So we don't have to work with something that's a strict anaerobe anymore. So this is thermophilic. It operates at a higher temperature, cellulitic, and a big thing for us, it's aerobic. So when we go through and try and do some of this, we could actually follow through experimentally and say, hey, does this actually happen? When we make predictions, does it work? So the other thing that I said, hey, this is a non-model organism. There's limited tools, limited information. First thing we had to do is we had to start by making our own genetic modification system. So we worked out ways to do gene deletions in this organism. We had to figure out what tools, what plasmids to be able to express genes. This organism has high native nucleus activity. So when you put genes in there and try and transform it, it breaks it down really quickly. So you had to figure out ways to circumvent that. But we came up with a genetic transformation system, came up with expression systems, and then we were able to work with this and figure out what does it do. The first thing we had to do was, how does it break down cellulose? So we went and looked at a predicted regulator for cellulitic activity, knocked it out and said, oh, this actually controls how it's able to break down cellulose. So we could actually increase, so dotted lines are, the solid black are wild type, unmodified. We went through and deleted this using our genetic system, and all of a sudden we can get spikes, we can get increases in cellulitic activity. So we can now take this organism and force it to break down cellulose faster by just studying what it does natively. Then we were able to go through and say, okay, we can make it break down cellulose faster, but can we make it produce something more useful? So we went through and looked at what it does natively. And then in this dashed line are things that are non-native. So we just said, hey, it can make propanil-CoA natively. Well, guess what? We can figure out if I take 2 genes from other organisms and borrow it and put it in here, I can actually make propanol from the propanil-CoA. So then we went through and took these 2 genes here, 2 steps, introduced it into this, so it breaks down cellulose, and try and get it to make propanol, and this is what we get. On the left-hand side is just growth rates. On the right-hand side is production of propanol. The interesting thing is this green right here that produces the most propanol, that is growing straight on switchgrass, unmodified switchgrass, which what I told you before is like, yes, you can take a handful of raw, untreated biomass like switchgrass, put it straight into a fermenter with this organism, and it will produce propanol for you as a one-step thing, one-step reaction. Nothing else needed, no pretreatment needed, right? So it's possible. I want to give you a sidebar for another organism we work with, Serratia marcescens, just to give you an idea that we can keep doing this, right? Different starting material, chitin, second most abundant carbon-containing material in the world, and we can make an antiviral compound out of it. So just to give you an idea, hey, we can keep doing this. We can keep changing our inputs, we can modify our process, and we can keep making different outputs. So Serratia is interesting because it breaks down chitin into acetylglucosamine, and then we can use that as a starting point for doing other things. What we did is we were trying to make neurominic acid, which can be used as an antiviral compound. And so to go from that N-acetylglucosamine to neurominic acid, we had to introduce 2 different heterogeneous genes that are borrowed from other organisms. And so here's the fun thing with synthetic biology. You go through and say, hey, I can control the expression of these. Figure out, can I make more neurominic acid by controlling the expression of these 2 genes? So all we're doing is we're saying, hey, do I want to have a lot, medium amount, or a little bit of these 2 genes in different proportions, and will it actually help me produce more of my neurominic acid? So this kind of promoter juggling helps us to balance the production so we can see if we can produce more neurominic acid. We went through a couple of rounds of toggling like strong, medium, or weak in front of the 2 genes. after a second round of design, what you're seeing here is this is our highest amount of neurominic acid that we can produce straight from chitin. Again, you're adding in straight chitin, producing neurominic acid straight from it. The interesting thing here is this design here has a strong promoter in front of the first gene, a medium promoter in front of the second gene. What this says is you don't go through and just dump in and have a lot of gene expression for everything all at once. That's not the most beneficial thing. Why is it? It's mostly because there is a trade-off in growth rate. So if you look at this on the left-hand side, we're just looking at growth again. Our two highest producing neurominic acid strains, it's because if you overexpress these non-native genes too much, it's detrimental to the cell. The cell just doesn't function as well. It doesn't grow as well. So you can't just take that engine from the Lamborghinis, stick it into a Honda Civic and expect it's going to drive well, right? There's detrimental effects. That's what we see with serratia. That's what you see by doing this kind of promoter balancing as well. And then I'm going to do a left-hand turn. I told you in my title, there's a side story. So all of that was just to talk about biotechnology. I want to take a quick side trip in sustainability, talk about the other E. So this is Institute of Sustainable Energy and Environment. So the side turn is on the environment side. So I run an undergrad only team outside of the work that I was just telling you there. And one of the projects that we worked on was this urban heat island effect here in Richmond. It was a really straightforward thing. You basically go through and say, hey, I take a thermocouple, link it to a GPS unit, and a lot of it, we made these kind of PVC pipe things. You stick it on a car. It looks kind of like those flags if you're rooting for your favorite football team or something. You stick it on there and you drive around. But instead of rooting for your team, we're taking temperature measurements. Okay? And when you do this at high resolution, you get a track that looks like this. You're getting measurements of temperature, surface temperature, like what you would experience as a person, about every 3 feet. Right. And so you're seeing this like cooler. This is the James River right here. This is the downtown Richmond area, the fan. So cooler along the river, warmer where there's all the developments and on the roads. Kind of what you would expect. Okay, this is intuitive, nothing mind-blowing about this. We did this and you send out about 20 different teams and you can compile this across the entire region so you get really high spatial resolution in terms of temperature variation. And so you get something that looks kind of like this as a starting point of temperature measurements. And you can see the variation in temperatures you have here is like 15 degrees Fahrenheit, just based off of where you are in the city. Okay. What we combined that with was some other factors that we got from the city, thinking about, okay, temperature is just this exposure thing. You're exposed to high temperature. But how this affects you in terms of a human health impact is you have all these other factors that you have to think about. So there's kind of sensitivity. This is when you think about, oh, the vulnerable population, the young and the elderly. That's sensitivity they're thinking about. The other part that we have to think about is adaptive capacity. So do you have the ability to overcome some of this? So if you have air conditioning, or if you don't have air conditioning, what if you are a person that is forced to work outside, like a manual labor working construction, and you're forced to work outside and you don't have the ability to take advantage of air conditioning? These all factor into, is that temperature going to actually affect you, right? So you put all that together and then you get a vulnerability map. So it's temperature, adaptive capacity, sensitivity, and you can figure out on a very regional, localized level, which areas of the city are more likely going to be affected by temperature. And when we mean affected, we're thinking about like heat stroke and other types of associated medical conditions that happen when you have elevated temperature. Okay. So we started doing that, put this information together. We have kind of a region by region, neighborhood by neighborhood picture of which areas of Richmond are more affected by heat. So over in Richmond, we get a lot of days that are above 90. So which of those areas are more likely to have ambulance calls or people going to the hospital because of this heat? So we did that. We went and looked. RAA is the Richmond Ambulance Authority. So where were the ambulance calls when you have these heat events being localized? So it's mostly right here. And if you overlay that with where this is, it's right in this area here. That looks highly correlative, but it's not, it doesn't prove anything. The most recent work we've been doing is we took some of this and we extrapolated across all of Virginia. So we looked at every zip code across Virginia for a 4-year period to try and see when you have elevated temperatures across all of Virginia. Model it to see if, and compare it against days when you don't have elevated temperature, see what is the effect of that temperature and having increased ER visits and hospitalizations for heat-related illnesses. And we went back and we're using insurance claim data, so all payers claim data, where you're looking for just heat-related or heat-adjacent illnesses. And you get, on these 80 days, on average in Virginia, we're getting about 80 days per year of elevated heat, so heat events. You're getting a 179% increase in ER visits and over 200% increase in hospitalizations on those days, which when you look at this numerically for the 80 days period, that's a 4,600 additional ER visits and about 2,000 additional hospitalizations a year, every year, just because of heat effects. So these are people going to the hospital and going to the ER because of that temperature just in Virginia. The next step of this is we're extrapolating this across all of the US, because obviously this is something that's happening not just in Virginia, but in multiple, well, globally. You hear about this every summer. You hear this, you know, from every place that, oh, X number of people died from the heat wave in X, Y, or Z place. But where this started with is a really small scale, easy thing to do. Take temperature measurements, get it localized, and then you can actually figure out which people are probably going to be affected, which people are more likely to be going to the ER in the hospital. And the fortunate thing about Richmond is we're able to work with the city, so they're using this for planning purposes, right? They're actually acting on this in policy. Master planning, sustainability plan, putting in new green infrastructure, allocating resources ahead of time when they're predicting heat waves to happen. They will send water, they will set up cooling centers, they will send medical personnel into those regions because we now know where those regions are that are disproportionately affected. So this is a quick snapshot on the environmental side. Started by giving you a little bit more of a biotech and energy side, but I just was gonna stop there. Thank you all for your attention and see if any questions on either of those kind of stories. Yes.
Ethanol, is that commercially viable from switchgrass?
So it is relatively low. If you looked at the actual number, the yield was actually pretty, like the actual amount, the yield is pretty low. But so we haven't taken the step of trying to commercialize it. We would probably, you know, take it a couple more steps and try to make it slightly more efficient. But realistically, the starting point of it is that the starting point is so cheap from a raw material standpoint. If you're just talking about switchgrass, there's no pre-treatment, there's no enzymatic treatment, there's no other pre-processing that's needed. You can make propanol and from there in a reasonably cost-effective manner because you don't have all the, you know, upfront costs, and it's just one step.
Well, that's George W. Bush State of the Union talking about ethanol from switchgrass.
Yeah.
That was going to be a breakthrough, and never seems to have happened.
Yeah, so the reason why I'm mentioning it that specifically this way is because one of the biggest hurdles that happened for a long time was the economics of the process was always because there was a pre-treatment with purified enzyme that was needed ahead of everything else, right? So that pre-processing step of having purified enzyme and doing a pre-processing of the cellulose just to be able to make the ethanol, you know, to get to sugars that can make the ethanol was always the most expensive part. This gets rid of that completely. Yeah.
So you saw that for propanol. Did you see that for hydrogen?
In terms of
Using switchgrass, is switchgrass a candidate for hydrogen as well, or?
yes. So for Clostridium, like so for the Clostridium thermocelum, yes, like that grows natively on any cellulosic biomass. Like the reason why I was using when we started doing this stuff experimentally in the lab, we're using switchgrass because you know you can kind of standardize that. You can get bulk quantities of switchgrass that are kind of categorized in lots, so you know that like the content because there's variability in cellulose content based off batches, but basically any of these different cellulosic biomasses can be used in either the Clostridium thermocelum or the thermobiphyta fusca, right? Without any pre-processing. And the same thing can be said for the Serratia for the chitin. There's not pre-processing that needed for it to be able to use chitin. So chitin is, you know, if you're unfamiliar, chitin, insect shells, seafood shells, all that type of stuff, which is why it's so abundant. Other questions? Great, thank you.
All right, I think we can get started now. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final event of the symposium. And so today with us, we have with us experts from various aspects of sustainable research. We have members of academia, national labs, industries, environmental communications firm. And so we have with us today Molly Mitchell from the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, Michael Donneberg from Virginia Commonwealth University, Miles Grant, Vice President of Denterlian Worldwide, Alex Moyes from Dominion Energy, and Ikena Lebedin from Ames National Lab, a US Department of Energy lab. And so the format of the panel is very simple. Each of our panelists will present their perspective of sustainable energy and environments to the audience for 10 to 12 minutes. And then the floor will be open to the audience to ask questions, and we will see where the discussion goes. So with that, I invite Molly to take the stage.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll come over here. Okay. So I'm going to talk today about the impacts of climate change on tidal marshes in Virginia and why we care about it. Okay, so first of all, why do you care about marshes? We care about them because not only do they provide habitat, they're a coastal environment, but they also provide us with a lot of free services. So they provide us with water quality improvement. And in fact, this is something that's been quantified and can be traded in certain areas as nutrient trading credits for water quality improvement in the Chesapeake Bay program. They also support fisheries, so they have an economic benefit there. So a lot of the young fish use marshes when they come in to protect from the bigger predators. The other one that's kind of a growing, just going to switch slides on this really quickly. The other one that's kind of a growing recognition is blue carbon. So blue carbon is carbon that's stored in the sediment of the marsh. And so you can see right here, all this dark sediment, it has a lot of carbon in it. So this is taken out of the atmosphere. So it's removing CO2 from the atmosphere, and then it's permanently storing it in the sediments. So it's a permanent removal. And there are actually markets, just like you can buy a carbon offset when you fly. That's usually a green carbon, someone's planting trees. There's actually a blue carbon market that's the same kind of thing. Okay, however, marshes are under a little bit of threat right now. They're changing a lot due to relative sea level rise. So relative sea level rise in Virginia is the highest along the entire Atlantic coast. The only place where it's rising higher in the US is in the Gulf Coast, where there's a lot of subsidence. So we're coming up about 5.5 millimeters a year, accelerating with a predicted 1.5 feet of sea level rise by the end of 2050. The important thing about sea level rise is not just that it's rising, it's accelerating, okay? So when we look at historic rates, it's coming up much faster now than it was the past. What happens to marshes when sea level rises? Well, there's actually a couple of things they do. Marshes are considered really resilient. And I want you to keep that in mind because they are some of the more resilient coastal habitats, and yet they're still under a lot of stress. So there's two things. Marshes can migrate, they can move landward. And this is basically as the water comes up, the tidal frame moves landward and the marsh goes along with it. So how this works is controlled by the elevation of the land behind it. If you have flat lands, then the marshes can expand and grow into them. If you have steep lands, the marshes get compressed. The other thing they can do is they can actually accrete sediment upwards. And this is one of the ways they can build carbon stocks too. So, I just want to say, sorry, that landward, not only does the elevation affect it, but when we put structures like bulkheads in along our shoreline, the marshes can no longer retreat. And then they drown. Okay, so this process allows the marsh to actually build its platform up and keep pace with tidal levels. It's a very, very complicated process. So we have changes in CO2, changes in water level, changes in temperature, all co-occurring at the same time, right? And each one of them has a different effect on this ability to build the marsh platform up. So this is actually not a process. This is a process that's occurring. It's not one that's going to really prevent the marshes from drowning because of the complication of all the different things going on at the same time. Okay, so if we look at how marshes have changed over the past, we're going to start with how they have changed, then how we expect them to change. We've done some work looking at marshes over the past 30 years. And so that was a 15 to 20 centimeter rise in sea level. And since that time, this is the York River. Bims is located down here. And then this is the York River going up along the middle of this here. We've seen about a 2.7% loss in marsh area along the York River. It's really variable though. So you can see the green ones. The green ones have actually seen expansion in marsh due to marsh migration. And then the red ones is where we've seen most of the loss of marsh. So it depends on the geology and it depends on the land use behind it, how much we'll see. The areas with the highest development, the most people living in it, are the areas where we've seen the most loss. These are also the area with the most boats and the most bulkheads. And so that's really contributed to the loss. The boat wakes help increase erosion and the bulkheads prevent the migration of the marshes. Also, high erosion from wave energy is another big thing. So the important thing to think about here is we have a small loss overall, right? But we've had 1/3 of the amount of sea level rise we're going to see in the next 30 years. So the past 30 years, right, 3 times that change in the next 30 years. We've also seen shifts in the plant communities. And this is important because the plant communities respond before the marsh itself actually disappears. So what this is telling us is these are marshes throughout the Chesapeake Bay and the change over a 30-year time period. Wherever you see a green marsh, that's a marsh which is starting to drown. So the marsh area hasn't decreased yet, but it will decrease rapidly in the next few years. The pink marshes that you can see up there are areas where they're becoming more saline. So as sea level rises, the salinity also increases. And so as the marsh community changes, the plants that it supports changes, the animals that support changes, the amount of carbon that it sequesters in the sediment changes. So everything changes as that salinity changes. So when we see those pink marshes, those are not necessarily marshes that are drowning, but they are marshes where the ecosystem services are changing. Okay, if we look forward into the future, so we look and say, well, how are things going to perform in the future? What we can see is, again, we have a really high variability. So these green marshes are marshes today, and the pink marshes are the predicted extent of the marshes in 2100. So in some areas like this region here, we actually see a slight expanse in the amount of marsh. In regions up here, we see almost total loss of marsh acreage in 2100. Overall, if we count it up throughout the Chesapeake Bay, we see about a 50% loss of marshes by 2050. And then it kind of holds steady around that kind of marsh loss at that time. So this is what we expect to see moving forward. Okay, so how does this affect our ecosystem services? I just want to focus on blue carbon a little bit. Like I said, it's a growing interest because of the blue carbon markets, the emerging blue carbon market. So what happens is as a marsh sits there over time, it accumulates a certain amount of carbon each year. Okay, and the longer a marsh is there, the more carbon it accumulates and the deeper that carbon layer is. So this is showing a marsh out in Poquoson. The blue area is the area that's inundated twice a day. And then some of these pink areas above it are the pink and yellow are areas that are inundated, not every day, but they are still marsh. So this marsh has been accumulating carbon for more than 100 years. It has really deep carbon stocks. It is, however, eroding on the water's edge of the marsh. Okay, so the marsh really needs to migrate to be able to stay sustainable. And if we walk through time and see what this happens, what this marsh looks like, what we see is the water starts to come up and initially the marsh is expanding. But now you see the darker blue. The darker blue is starting to go underwater, and the light blue is where the marsh is. And as we move out to 2100, we see that most of the marsh has gone underwater, and we just have small amounts of the light blue intertidal, and then we'll have little areas up here that are occasionally inundated. So what this leaves us with is we had this big marsh, that whole yellow boxed area that had 100 years of carbon sequestered in it. And we're moving forward to something where we have a small little red marsh here with 40 years of carbon sequestration. And then this orange bit that only has 20 years of carbon sequestration. So it's a much smaller footprint, and it's a much shallower amount of carbon in it. So if we can't protect the edge of this marsh and keep it from eroding, we're actually looking at losing a huge amount of our carbon stocks. Okay, so what are the key takeaways here? So sea level rise is accelerating, which is driving accelerating change in the marshes. The changes we've seen over the past 30 years are going to happen more and more rapidly. And so this is going to have consequences for the services that we rely on marshes for. So, and that, I think we're waiting for questions until the panel, or do we have time for questions now? Wait for the questions. All right. So I will pass it off to microphone. Right.
All right, good afternoon. A disclaimer, this is not my research. I don't do research on anything like the health consequences of climate damage, but it is a passion for me. I'm an infectious disease physician and mostly in research administration now. A lot of what I'm going to say in this short period is about the consequences of what you've been hearing about before on a personal level to you, to your family, and especially to individuals who belong to marginalized groups. So when sea levels rise and the climate undergoes unpredictable and massive events happen because of climate change, there's always a disproportional effect on marginalized populations, as you heard in better detail from Dr. Fong just a little while ago. And as you heard earlier today, the coasts are going to become completely unlivable, and there are going to be more, and there already are, tremendous amount of droughts and malnutrition. And all of these, of course, affect individual people and affect their health. And the wealthier countries have a better ability to adapt, and poorer countries are going to suffer more. And all of this, as you heard, is already and will in an accelerating fashion lead to mass human migration. And that is actually a big concern for the Department of Defense and has been so for quite some time. This quote is from 2014 about how there's going to be more conflict due to these events. All of these are, these are geopolitical and social things, but they also affect individuals and their health. When there are migrants and refugee camps, there's less access, there's virtually no access to healthcare. There's more malnutrition, there's more child death, there's less vaccination, and there are epidemics of diseases that are completely preventable. In fact, a group of more than 100 different medical journals last year simultaneously published an editorial that said that climate change is the single greatest threat to human health. And besides famine and malnutrition, there's direct heat-related illness, there's increase in cardiopulmonary disease, infectious diseases, and let's not forget mental illness. So Dr. Fung just told you about some very local data. This is some of the early work that he did, and I got this from Jeremy Hoffman, but showing an increase in ER visits for heat-related illness depending upon the temperature. So actually, extreme heat kills an excess of 600 people in the US alone every year, but then we have these heat waves that kill, hundreds in other countries all the time. And besides heat stroke and heat death, there's also just an increased background in mortality, and this disproportionately affects vulnerable populations like the children and the elderly. Men and pregnant women are more susceptible, those who work outdoors, you've heard that mentioned, and the poor can't afford air conditioning, and those who are isolated very often suffer the worst. Also, those with pre-existing conditions, some of which are mentioned there, and those who take certain types of medication are far more susceptible. So we have more of these extreme heat days, and we have more of a susceptible population. The climate catastrophe is also leading to an increase in cardiopulmonary disorders, including asthma. The particulate matter that is a byproduct of burning all fossil fuels gets inhaled deep into all the way to the alveoli, crosses the blood, the barrier, epithelial barrier into the bloodstream, and those particles are inflammatory, and they can damage the lungs, and they can go throughout the body and cause vascular diseases. And so there's a direct correlation between incidence of stroke and heart attack and how much particulate matter there is. Once again, vulnerable populations in certain, parts of cities are exposed to more than people who live in other areas. In addition to burning fossil fuels, massive wildfires, which are another consequence of climate change, also can radically increase the amount of particulate matter in the air for weeks in areas affected. Also, there's an increase in ground level ozone on hot days, which is a product of volatile organic compounds, nitrogen oxides, the sunlight and the heat, and the ozone, highly reactive oxygen species, and causes increase in asthma. And you can see that asthma hospitalization is also very localized, depending upon what your neighborhood is, where your neighborhood is. Richmond is really bad. And we also have, asthma is also, an allergic disease, and we have longer pollen seasons. And ragweed is covering more of the country than it had before. And ragweed is a principal allergen. Increased heat also affects pregnancy outcomes. There is more early birth and low birth rate, where there's more ozone and more particulate matter and higher temperature. And once again, a disparity issue. These effects are greater in African Americans and those who already suffer from asthma. Climate change is really changing the face of infectious diseases as well. Part of that is due to vectors that distribute disease, like the Anopheles mosquito that carries malaria has been spreading south from the equator in Africa and up to higher elevations with warming temperatures. More locally, Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus, which can spread Zika, chikungunya, and dengue, have been increasing throughout the United States. And the deer tick, Ixodes scapularis, which spreads Lyme disease, has been increasing its distribution. And also more adult ticks are active longer in the year. And so you can get Lyme now any month of the year, pretty much. With warmer temperatures, we have increased risk of horrible infections. If you're exposed to brackish water, there's a necrotizing fasciitis that can lead to death or loss of limb. And there's toxic algal blooms, or a combination of phosphorus and nitrogen runoff, and rising temperatures, and those can cause neurologic symptoms, mostly neurologic symptoms. There's a we heard reference to fungi, taking over, but this is actually a real phenomenon. There's a untreatable yeast infection that has been described now in multiple continents. It wasn't described before about 2003. And the causative organism is a yeast that didn't used to grow in body temperature, but now it's infecting people who are heavily immunocompromised. And it's thought that it's been adapting to warmer temperatures and now can grow to body in people. And it's pretty scary because we really don't have any drugs that can treat it. And finally, whenever we have horrible floods from storms, there can be an increase in many diseases, as I mentioned, with just mass migration. And in fact, here are some particular events. After Hurricane Katrina, there was a huge outbreak of norovirus among people who were in a temporary housing. It wasn't really housing, in a convention center. And just this last fall, when I forget the hurricane that hit the west coast of Florida, there was a sudden increase in the number of cases of people with necrotizing fasciitis, wading through these waters and with broken skin from injuries. And I must mention mental health as well, because the amount of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and even suicides following catastrophic events is measurable. And there's a new phenomenon of anxiety over climate change. This morning I was driving down 95 in my electric vehicle, and a song from a band called Wild Child came on, and it's called Freaking Me Out. That's the name of the song, Freaking Me Out. And the basic theme is that with climate change, the singer is beginning to engage in some impulsive behavior, because what the hell, we're all going to die anyway. It's a pretty good song, though. You should check it out. So I hate to end on a downer. So with that as like the bottom, I think there are recent events that have really caused me to feel more optimistic, and I hope they do you as well. We heard a lot this morning about some policy wins and changes in laws that are pretty exciting. We might reach 80% of our 2030 target just from this alone, but I think the hope is that this is in a background of enabling and accelerating and more awareness. And, as there are more EV charging stations, there are going to be fewer gas stations, and people who are reluctant can say, I can't find a decent gas station anymore. There's EV chargers everywhere. I'm going to get my EV. I think we're hitting some momentum, and that's pretty exciting. I also think that it's great to imagine the future when we're solving these problems. And this is the low line right here in Richmond, all native plants. It's gorgeous. So we have to keep in mind that it's not your fault. It's mostly the banks and politicians' faults and fossil fuel industry. And we can imagine a better future with livable cities and working together to erase racism and inequity, fast, reliable transit, streets that are covered in trees, clean air, beautiful water recovering ecosystems, forests, etc. So I'd encourage you to keep all of this in mind as you do all your work.
Thank you. Next up, we have Miles Grant.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. My name is Miles Grant. I want to thank you all for inviting me today. I know communications is not something that is often discussed at events like this. So thank you for letting me talk for a few minutes about some best practices for communicating about science. This is not necessarily a science in itself in terms of communications. This is just advice, some guidance, some general research, and based on some of my experiences. So I used to direct communications for the National Wildlife Federation, for Woodwell Climate Research Center in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Before that, I was a local TV news producer, and I'm a lifelong environmental activist. Lived in Arlington, Virginia for about 10 years and was very active in the Virginia political and environmental movements. The picture is from the Gulf oil disaster in, was it 2010? And that was oil-covered seaweed in the Gulf. So I am here to give you some general guidance, but I always try to say to scientists first, I'm not here to tell you how to science. That is not my job. What I am here to do is to try to give you some tips about how to better communicate that science to inspire action. Obviously, the March for Science a few years ago was a big opportunity to do that. So, you know, I would really love to hear from you all once this panel is concluded, more about your successes and failures, what's worked and what hasn't worked. The good news here is that you are very trusted. I think despite the increasing attacks on science that probably ramped up in about 2016 for some reason, you are still among the most trusted professions. And if you see at the bottom of the list is politicians generally. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, though, that you are very trusted. It's important to use that trust for the causes that you care about. It's also important to protect that trust as much as you can. And I know that can be a fine line to walk sometimes. Basically, what I'm saying is I never want to see any of you on Fox News. Do not lend your credibility to outlets like that. But if there is an opportunity to talk to CNN, to your local public radio or something like that, you should really strongly consider doing it. I think a lot of times folks worry about talking about issues that might be slightly outside their area of expertise. But if it's something the public is already talking about, you get your scientific credibility that you can lend an explanation, some recommendations, consider it. So when you think about your messaging and how to frame your messaging, you want to think about your audience. Who is it that you're looking to talk to? The audience that I use a lot of times is my mom. She's somebody who's knowledgeable. She cares about environmental issues. She wants to help. She's open to a call to action. But I know she's not an expert. I can't use overly scientific language with her, or else I'm going to lose her. She'll tell me right away. So it's just something to keep in mind where if I'm trying to frame up a message, what is she going to understand? What's going to move her to action? She's just somebody that is easy to think about. That's my daughter, Olivia, who's now 9 years old. So in terms of how to tell your stories, can anybody tell where I forgot to put a picture in my presentation, by the way? You want to talk about what is the problem, who's causing it, how can we solve it, and try to give them some hope. You obviously did very well in your presentation about closing with some hope and a call to action there at the end. I think some voices in the scientific community would make the case that you don't want to be negative. You want to avoid negativity. You don't want to depress people. I think it's fine to just think about depressing things, that picture of the necrotizing, whatever it was. It's okay to do stuff like that, to say these are horrible things could happen if we don't address climate change, but you want to close with that hope. You want to close with that call to action. You don't want to leave people feeling hopeless that this isn't a problem that we can solve. So you want to try to connect to people and to places that they care about. When I was at National Wildlife Federation, we would try to use really specific species. If we were in Minnesota or New Hampshire, we'd try to talk about moose, a species that's really being hurt by climate change. Try to bridge from the lab to ordinary lives as much as you can. You want to try to connect the dots for people and don't make them do it on their own. Usually if you're in a public communication setting, you're struggling to maintain folks' attention as it is. You don't want to make them try to understand acronyms that they don't know, terms that they don't know. There's a website now called Hemingway that you can enter any text into it and it will and enter the grade level that you want to be trying to reach. 6th grade audience is generally the considered public scientific knowledge. And the website will tell you whether your text is appropriate for the audience or not and what to change. Uncertainty is a big thing that I talk to scientists a lot about. The scientific community strongly values uncertainty, that it's a way of showing what you don't know and what you're trying to find out. For the public, uncertainty, they hear you don't know what you're talking about. What you want to do instead is try to lead with what you do know and maybe close with the questions you want to answer next. Myth versus fact is a tough one. It's often you see in public communication, people leading with the myth and then trying to debunk that myth. But what studies show is that folks tend to remember the myth as much as the answer. And if you quiz them again a month later, they might not remember which was which. You want to talk about the risks and costs of inaction. That sometimes it's just, especially when it comes to climate change, people just want to talk about the cost of clean energy, the cost of the transition. Obviously, we have great risks to our coastal communities if we don't act. I would say, you want to try to, again, tailor to your audience. I feel like I'm repeating some of the great talks that we've had already here about connecting the dots to health, connecting the dots to economics and job opportunities. Don't be afraid to connect the dots to the environment as well. I know a lot of people are like, we can't talk about the polar bears. People don't care about the polar bears. They would care about jobs, but people do care. You do want to try to connect it to a local audience as much as possible. I live up in Massachusetts. We want to talk to people up there. We talk about impact to fisheries, that there's going to be a great deal of impact there. Don't be afraid to ask for help when you can. That you want to build a network of allies. You've got your own organization, maybe your university's communications team is very happy to help you. You've got partners who might have their own networks they could reach out to. Some traditional media like environmental reporters, TV meteorologists are very often their station's biggest science communicators. Build relationships, answer questions. I was looking for an image for this one and I almost used the Avengers for building your network and building your allies, but I thought this is from The Martian, where you had the scientist, the administrator, and the communications team coming together to rescue Matt Damon. So you want to set reasonable expectations. The story of the Grinch or Scrooge or something like that, where somebody is going from villain to hero within a 30-minute TV program, probably not realistic. However, in Star Wars, Han Solo starts out as somebody who hates the Empire already. And so Princess Leia, activates him to be a hero by the end of the movie. That's a little bit more of a reasonable move for your communications and for your efforts. I would finally say, don't be afraid to celebrate success when you can. It's not something that we often get to do, especially in the environmental and scientific community, to celebrate a big win. But when I look back on my career, we got to participate in the ceremony for taking the bald eagle off the endangered species list. There's a lot of progress that gets taken for granted. Osprey are back in Massachusetts. Bald eagles are nesting in Massachusetts again. They weren't when I was a kid. People don't necessarily recognize the progress or the success, but it's part of that sort of proof that we can solve the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Miles. With that note, I invite Alex Moss to the stage, and Alex is from Dominion Energy, and you'll hear his take on sustainability next.
Great, thank you. Oh, we might need to switch to not here to address your energy bills. Okay, so take that up with our billing group. So I'm here to talk about probably the more forgotten part of renewable energy. So we're going to be talking a little bit about critical minerals and why energy companies should be more concerned about critical minerals than I think they are. Auto manufacturers are the model right now for critical minerals, and we'll get to that a little bit further into the presentation. So, but first I want to talk about Dominion. For those of you who are local to Virginia, you hopefully know that Dominion is headquartered here in Richmond. We are one of the largest energy companies in the nation. So we've got 17,000 employees. We operate in 13 states. As far west, we actually have distributed solar in California, big gas operations in Utah, Ohio, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. We've got about 30 gigawatts of generating capacity. A good chunk of that is nuclear. We have 4 nuclear power plants. And we are very much growing on the renewable side. So this is part I think most of you are interested in. We've heard a lot about emerging technologies, whether that's thin film solar with perovskites. We've talked a lot more about modeling and optimization of offshore wind, but we're actually doing that. So we've got to take all of this work that's going on in the labs, and we've got to figure out how we actually can do this at the commercial scale. So we think we figured this out with our coastal Virginia offshore wind project. And so that's part of the $22 billion that we have committed to zero carbon generation over the next 5 years. So that's offshore wind. We're growing from 2,000 megawatts of solar. We'll be going up to about 10,000 plus megawatts of utility scale solar. And of course, we're doing a lot with hydrogen right now. And we're doing a lot with renewable natural gas. But over the next 5 years, 37 billion is what's going to be dedicated towards growing the renewables and the carbon-free energy generation in our service territories. So we'll dive in a little bit on coastal Virginia. So earlier on, a couple of days ago, we heard about some of the largest turbines that were theoretically going to be out there at 15 megawatts. Well, we're putting in 14.7 megawatts. If we round up, we're right there at the 15 megawatt. In fact, we're putting 176 of those 27 miles off of the coast of Virginia. We've got 2 that are already running. They've been running for a few years now as a pilot. We're also building the Charbitis, which is a installation vessel. We've already got that contracted out for multiple projects up and down the Atlantic coast, including ours, which should be constructed by 2026. So we talked a lot about the environmental impacts. We've talked about the economic impacts, the jobs. So we are increasing a lot of jobs down in the Hampton Roads area. So I won't hit on all those stats, but you can read those. But at the end of this, we'll have 2.6 gigawatts of carbon-free energy generation. So again, this all sounds really good. But what I want to focus on now is the behind the scenes that we don't really talk much about. And that's the sustainability of all the mining that needs to go in to accomplish this. So a few interesting facts. So to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, what you're going to find is that a lot of these minerals that we're producing, they're going to switch. So they're no longer going to be used for what they're currently being used for. They're going to dominantly be used for energy generation. So if you look at copper, so you'll be over 40% of the copper produced will be for clean energy. For rare earth elements, 60, 70%. Nickel and cobalt is at 60, 90%, and 90% for lithium. So about 10 years ago, about 25% of lithium was used for energy storage. So fast forward, you'll have 90% of that used for stationary storage. So these critical minerals are being redeployed in very many different ways and very rapidly. So we're going to see massive demand for these critical minerals. Now, a lot of them aren't produced in high quantities. So when you see staggering numbers like 3,000%, you're starting from a pretty small base, but still nonetheless, these are very significant numbers. 4,000% for lithium. And then you've got graphite, cobalt, and nickel growing at about 2,500%. And copper will only double. That sounds, will double. That's not very much. But considering we produce 21 million tons of copper per year, that's going up to 40 million tons of copper. So that's a massive amount of earth that we're going to be moving to accomplish our non-carbon-free energy generation. So just for power generation, we're increasing by 300% the amount of minerals that go into power generation. And it turns out that offshore wind is the most critical mineral intensive of all of the power generating sources. So here's an interesting fact. Humanity has mined so far approximately 700 million tons of copper. We're going to need to mine that same amount of copper in the next 22 years to accomplish our energy transition. So here's what's the scary part about that. So Escondida, that's a picture of Escondida. I've actually been there. It's a fantastic part of the Atacama Desert. So they have actually had to increase their energy consumption by 1,600% just to maintain the same amount of copper production that they were doing in the early 2000s. And that's because grades of copper are declining significantly. In about the mid 1950s, 1960s, you had 2 to 3% copper grades. We're down to about 0.1%, 0.5% would be a really good grade. So we're now having to move a lot more earth just to get the same quantity, but now we have to double that. So think about that. We talk about electric vehicles, which are very important to the energy transition, but a single 1,000-pound electric battery requires right around 500,000 pounds of raw materials just to actually, so that means you've got to mine X amount of, raw material, process it down to these small grades of say 1% or even less than 1% to get those 1,000 pounds. So just to transition all of the passenger cars, we're going to have to mine more materials in the next 25 years than we have in all of human history. So that includes gravel, that includes aggregates, that includes copper, that includes steel, that includes you name it. So it is a massive amount of earth moving. So I'm going to show a couple of charts here. So these are critical minerals in energy production. So again, I mentioned offshore wind. So that's in blue. So lots and lots of copper, a little bit of nickel, manganese, chromium, zinc, significant amounts of zinc. We don't really talk a lot about zinc, rare earth elements. And then onshore wind's very similar. Solar PV, of course, is mostly copper and silicon. If you look at thin film solar, that's where you get into your more unique ones like your cadmium, tellurium, those types of different critical minerals. Those are hard too, because take tellurium, for example, there's no such thing as a tellurium mine. Tellurium is actually something that's processed off of the copper slime on the anodes. And so we're basically dependent upon producing enough copper to harvest the about 30% recoverable tellurium from those anode slimes. So we have a lot of these critical minerals are actually byproducts. So that's another risk that we've got to be thinking about. And of course, it should be pretty obvious critical minerals in internal combustion engines versus EVs. There's anywhere from 4 to 6 times the amount of critical minerals in our electric vehicles. So a couple of other interesting facts. So I mentioned, about 4,000% increase in lithium mining. Right now, the bulk majority of lithium mining comes from evaporating lithium brines in the lithium triangle in Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. And so that requires a massive amount of water to be evaporated. So there are emerging technologies like direct lithium extraction, which greatly reduces the evaporation needed to get the lithium. But we still need to produce a lot more graphite. This is also, I think, one of the forgotten critical minerals. About 40% of the mass of the battery in your electric vehicles is actually graphite, and that goes for stationary storage as well. And then rare earth elements, you're right around 700% increase. And we'll talk a little bit more about rare earth elements here in a bit. Want to talk about geopolitical tensions. So we've had significant geopolitical tensions just for oil and gas production over, say, the last 50 years. But oil and gas production has been produced largely in 15, 20, 25 major countries, and we still have those tensions. A lot of these critical minerals, they're dominantly produced in 2 or 3 countries. So there's a lot of geopolitical tensions already building around critical minerals. So that's something that we need to be aware of. And certainly our policymakers are thinking about it. So now I want to quickly run you through a quick utility case study, and then we'll wrap up. So I mentioned 176 turbines, 14.7 megawatt. We'll have those in by 2026. For the Atlantic coast, the ambition, and so far the planned installment is between 20 and 30 gigawatts by 2030. So that's going to be not 176 turbines, but about 1,630 of these turbines by 2030. And that's if you're using the big dogs, the 15 megawatts. Per the IEA, global offshore wind power, where it needs to be or in what they're projecting by 2050, is 2,870 gigawatts. So that's about almost 200,000 of these turbines that will need to be installed globally to meet the ambitions of the IEA forecast that we're going to need to be doing. Now, these are very number heavy, but here's what I want you to focus on. So just for Dominion Energy's project, if you just take the copper, the zinc, the manganese, the chromium, nickel, rare earth elements, molybdenum, we've got billions of pounds. So it's like, well, billions of pounds. I don't know how to imagine billions of pounds. So I've done that for you. That's 14 Empire State Buildings worth of earth excavation to refine the critical minerals needed just for our 176 turbines. So if you've ever been to the Empire State Building and you've looked up at it, those are holes in the earth that are going to be there. For our requirements for the Atlantic coast, 127 of these Empire State Buildings worth of earth removed for our Atlantic coast ambitions. Our global ambitions, 15,000 Empire State Buildings worth of material are going to have to be mined. And again, this doesn't factor in that these world average grades are declining every single year. So this number could be way off. Now, fortunately, we have a lot of reserves. And so just for offshore wind, we're not really putting a big dent in the actual reserves. But this is what we need to be thinking about is how can we actually recycle? How can we actually mine waste streams? And so that's something that I'm proposing here. So rare earth elements, turns out, are actually found in coal. They're found geologically. There's a lot of reasons I won't get into why they're in there. But they have fairly low concentrations. But what do we have? We have a ton of coal here in the United States, and we've combusted billions and billions of tons of coal, which have left us with a lot of coal ash. So far, there's no currently commercial operations to extract rare earth elements from coal products. The DOE has been trying to tackle this for 6-7 years. Dominion Energy, we're starting to get involved. We're doing some pretty cool research right now. And I think we've got a very innovative way that we might be able to start economically producing rare earth elements from our coal ash landfills. So hopefully, maybe next year I can give you all an update and let you know where we're at with that. Because if you saw on the turbines, we'll be using about 1.5 million pounds of rare earth elements, neodymium and praseodymium specifically, in those permanent magnets in our offshore wind turbines. So what can we do about it? Well, first and foremost, again, this isn't the popular thing to say, but energy companies, just like auto companies, they should be supporting domestic mining. We have way higher standards than we do compared to a lot of parts of the world. Investing in mining projects, just like GM invested in lithium project at Thacker Pass, 600 million. And then of course, we want to make sure whoever we're procuring from, that they're procuring their critical minerals from companies that are actually doing it sustainably. So with that, thank you for your time.
Thank you. That was excellent, Alex. And this gives a good segue for our last speaker. That's Ekena from Ames National Lab. And he will be talking to us about sustainable recycling of rare earths from permanent magnets. So it's very timely.
Tell me if I speak too loud to scare you. If you laughed, then no. All right, thank you. Excellent segue, Alex. My name is Ekena Nlebedim. I work in the Critical Materials Institute. And part of what I'm going to talk to you today is, following what Alex says, some activities related to remining rare earth elements from materials we already have. And I'll get into that. And I'll tell you, I was just so happy when Alex was presenting, because when I was putting my slides together, the first question I asked myself, how much background material should I put in here? Well, if I put all this background material, then I can show actual research. So you did the job for me. Thank you. I'm from Ames Lab. The Critical Materials Institute has its headquarters in Ames Lab, and we just celebrated our 75th birthday. So we are a U.S. Department of Energy National Lab located in Ames, Iowa. Started as part of the Manhattan Project. And eventually we became, I want to say that we are the only national lab that is located on university campus. I had a claim by Slack yesterday. They are 1 mile away. We are right on campus of the university. So we beat them. But I tell you what this means. It means that students can walk in and access the kind of facilities you can get from National Lab very easily. Very close collaboration. A number of people in the lab, including myself, have affiliation with the university. I'm part of the electrical and computer engineering department. So that gives us a lot of interaction both from collaboration perspective, but from also including training the future generation when it comes to clean energy related matters. The Critical Materials Institute is a US Department of Energy national lab. It was established about 10 years ago. And our mission is to accelerate innovative scientific and technological solutions to develop resilient supply chain. We started with rare earth elements, but now we started including other type of critical materials, such as batteries and materials for semiconductors and so on. Our footprint is growing, and please, we will be happy to have anyone be part of the CMI. So we have 4 national labs as part of the CMI, and then we have our industry partners and the several universities. And these are the logos for our partners, current partners. Now, in terms of how we address materials criticality, we do this under 4 pillars. The first pillar here, which we call diversifying supply. So we go back to what Alex said. We got to dig the earth to get rare earth. Take up a mine here, the Mountain Pass for an example. The problem with Mountain Pass is not that we don't have rare earth. In fact, Mountain Pass is one of the mines that have higher quality rare earths in the world. But despite that, we have a lot of cerium and lanthanum. We have good amount of neodymium and praseodymium, but very tiny dysprosium. And you would prefer your EV, the magnet in your EV, to have some dysprosium in it, because that means that it would not demagnetize, because when it demagnetizes, then you don't have an electric vehicle anymore. So if you think about mining, one way to look at addressing criticality is, okay, we don't have a lot of dysprosium. Should we mine more, dig more earth to get dysprosium? Or should we find an alternative source for dysprosium? So that's one way we look at it. The other thing we do is that we develop substitutes. What else in the periodic table can behave like dysprosium when we put that in the magnet? So if we don't want to use dysprosium for high temperature application, well, there are other elements, there are other things we can do. We could use cobalt. Cobalt will increase the performance of your magnet. But I see the people asking, well, hey, if you're using cobalt, what happens to the battery? Because we need cobalt for the battery. But again, this is where research comes in. We need to find other elements that allow us to accomplish the same purpose. The other thing we do is recycling, reuse and recycling. As you will see in my presentation today, in the CMI, we focus more on recycling rather than reuse. And you would understand the reason a bit later. And then we have cross-cutting research. And what this research is, what this pillar is, to support research in these 3 areas. So what that means is, I'm trained in magnetism and magnetic materials, and I do recycling, but I don't do thermodynamic calculations. There are things I don't do, life cycle analysis, techno-economic analysis. I don't do those. We have people here whose job are to provide those as needed and tailored to a particular technology development. One thing with the CMI is that as we develop technology, we try to look at it from environmental a perspective and economic perspective from day one. So some projects are killed just because it's not going to get to the market. It's cool. You can publish a Nature paper, but it's not going to get anywhere. So projects are killed just because of that. So why recycle? Again, thanks to Alex. He did the job. There is need to meet growing demands. And these are some announcements that we've seen. And GM will sell only zero emission vehicles by 2035. That's going to require a lot of rare earths. The Rare Earth Observer, actually, this relates to the geopolitical tension. China tightens export ban of samarium cobalt and neodymium ion boron magnets. And this is going to put us in a very difficult situation when we talk about our transition to clean energy. And then here, Bloomberg neodymium market size is going to increase. And here, Adamas Intelligence is saying they're forecasting global shortage of neodymium boron alloy and powders that will amount to 66,000 tons annually by 2030. These numbers are big. And if we don't do something today, then we're going to have a big challenge for the clean energy transition. So what I'm going to talk about is recycling, and this shows you the status. With all these things said, Alex talked about recycling of rare earth from coal ash. What I'm going to talk about is recycling of rare earth from magnets and electronic waste. So here you see about less than 1% of rare earths are recycled from data from IEA. And then here you see that the rare earth collection, sorry, the e-waste collection rate is really stagnated. I'm yet to get the data for 2020 onwards, but you see it's just stayed there for a while, whereas the generation rate is just increasing. And we actually expect that this might even take a more exponential form as we transition to clean energy technology, because things are going to be more electronically inclined. So this is in the Critical Materials Institute, we prioritize because we look at the dollar amount we have from the government, and then we look at what can we do with that dollar amount to actually make an impact. We don't just do research just because it's available to be done. So here are challenges. Limited and non-centralized collection of end-of-life products. In the United States today, it's really very difficult for you. I don't know what you have here in Virginia, but if you go to some states, you don't have a place where you say, okay, this is where e-waste go. And it varies from state to state, and within a state, it can even vary from county to county. And this is a problem. And then there is also there is variation and the evolution of the product design, the change over time. Phones change very frequently, computer things evolve, and that means that if you're designing for recycling, then you have two options. One is that you design something that is robust enough and it can adapt to anything imaginable, and you know that's not possible. Or you then can adapt your technology as things change. Either way is a challenge. Then critical materials are embedded in devices. Now, I like to talk about this because when we talk about recycling of rare earths in magnets, immediately what comes to people's mind is, here is magnet to recycle. You don't recycle magnets. No one is going to bring to you magnet and recycle. They're going to give you a computer. And then in the computer, you have a hard drive. In the hard drive, you have a magnet. So you got to think, what do I do with the what do I do to the computer to get to the hard drive, then to get to the magnet in which I have only 20% of rare earth as part of the magnet composition, or 30%. So now it becomes a very complex problem, and it's very diluted. That's really the point. How do we reclaim material that is diluted and still be economical about it? And when I say economics, underline that, because we are competing on a global scale. Other countries, there are countries that have cheap labor. There are companies that don't care about environment. And so they're going to produce this cheaper. It doesn't matter how much we wish. And we have also built our economy on competition in terms of capitalism. So which means if I can't make profit with that, where do I take that? I'm going to go a bit faster. And then there are opportunities. So this is the good part to that. There are opportunities and feedstock. There are feedstock that contain critical materials. Often other valuable constituents are present. This is what we call co-recovery. So we talked about tellurium today, which is a byproduct of copper mining. So if you're recovering rare earth elements, what else can you get at the same time in order to balance that economics? And so on. In the CMI, we actually stay in the center. We try to focus on feedstock that can be efficiently collected. We do co-recovery. We focus on materials that require minimal processing, lower footprint, and also superior environmental performance. What we want to do is that we want to do it cheaper, greener, and faster. I will show you some examples now before I finish. So here is one of the work that is led out of Idaho National Lab. What they're doing here is bioleaching, and this is really engaging biological materials to leach out the rare earth. Most of the work in recycling is really how do you get things into solution? It's the biggest challenge. Once you have rare earth in solution, precipitation is easy. So how do you get it into solution? In this case, they are using agricultural waste to feed some bugs, and then the bugs would eventually be used to, so you have here industrial waste, and then you put them here, the bugs will leach them out, and then you can pull rare earth materials out of that, and then you have some waste, and then you put the rare earths, use the rare earths to make materials again. So this technology is a subject of an R&D 100 award, which is from Idaho National Lab. And here is a bioseparation one. Again, this is using some protein structures, which they call lamondinite, and then they modify the surface, and it has the ability to bind to some rare earths, so that when you treat it, when you put the rare earth with the protein, it binds to those, and then you can collect non-rare earth here, but then you can go here and then separate each of the rare earths. So you can have praseodymium separately, neodymium separately, dysprosium separately. And this is also another technology, which is e-recovery, uses electrochemistry. And what it does is that you take shredded electronic waste, in this case could be shredded hard drive, which is typically shredded because of security, data security. And then you can go through a dissolution. And first of all, you go through pre-separation, which is now shown here. And then you do a dissolution, then a precipitation, and eventually you get rare earth oxide that goes back into the supply chain. And this is another work which I contributed to, but also led out of Idaho National Lab. In this case, what they're trying to do is they use pressure and then dimethyl ether, and they process the material without chemical. And this is the good thing. By the time, because the dimethyl ether is recyclable, and so under pressure, they can, as they're pumping that, they can separate the liquid from the solids, and eventually you can have a complex waste separated. So here you have 91% of cobalt, 0.5% of iron, and 0.5% of samarium and iron. And then here you have, where you have two types of magnet together, and then you can separate those individually. I'm going to focus right now on the last example, which is a technology that I helped develop. And this is called the acid-free dissolution. It's a hydrometallurgical process, which is really using copper-based solution. What we did here is really to go back to a high school chemistry and apply this high school chemistry to recycling of rare earth, and you see how this works. So now you see, take a material, in this case, nail, you put it in a copper solution. With time, copper will start precipitating as metal, and then the iron will go in solution. And then you can recover this copper as copper metal powder, or if you leave it for a while, it's going to oxidize, and then you have copper oxide. Now, you can think of this nail as the magnet. If you put magnet in this, exactly the same thing is going to happen. And that's what we've done. And so we've used this process to recycle rare earth magnets. And you may say, why does that matter? It matters because, remember we talked about hard disk drive. So if you pick magnet, you have neodymium, iron, and boron. That's easy, or maybe praseodymium and dysprosium. That's easy to recycle. But if you have hard drive that is shredded, now you have more than half of the periodic table in which you're going to go get the rare earth out from there. What this process does is that you can take that shredded hard drive in the form that is shredded, and you put it in solution, and it will selectively leach the magnet. So the copper is still there to be recovered as copper. Aluminum is still there to be recovered as aluminum. Every other thing you have there will still be recovered. So it doesn't affect that. You think about it as washing it off. So you wash it, it goes into solution. The rest continue their journey. Now you have rare earth in solution. So one of the advantages of this process is the environmental benefits, because here we are comparing it with the process of getting rare earth from primary mining. And you can see a lot of the parameters that are associated with life cycle analysis. And you would see that the only one that this process has a problem with is ecotoxicity. And you would say, why? Why? It's because the life cycle analysis was done honestly. And I'll tell you what that means. If we were blind to where the materials that come into the process, how those materials are obtained, everything in the green, everything for the green will be all down here. So what we look at is we use copper-based solution. What's the footprint of producing copper in the first place? Because we can't be blind to that. Without copper-based solution, we wouldn't do the process. So whatever footprint of making copper has to be factored into the footprint of the technology itself. Now, but we have this challenge here. And in the rest of it, we're actually in all of this, what you're seeing here is mostly from the footprint of producing copper. So what we have done in order to address this is to keep the copper in the cycle. So which means, remember when you put that nail in the solution, the copper precipitates out. Instead of going to sell the copper and then buy another copper, we let the copper oxidize, use it to produce another copper salt, and then keep that copper salt in the solution. And when we did that, I don't have the result here, all these things now went down. Now we know that over time we will need to regenerate, but the impact will not be as it is right now. And these are some of the products that were recovered when we did this at lab scale. So you have samarium oxide. So this works with neodymium iron boron. It works with samarium cobalt magnet. So that's samarium oxide, cobalt oxide, different types. This is that copper powder that we produce. We eventually use this to produce copper salt and other stuff. Then this is cobalt phosphate. We eventually take the rare earth oxide. We went back and make magnet just to show that what we are recovering can go back into the supply chain. And now we are in the commercialization phase. This technology has been transferred to a company called T-Divide LLC. So when we did this in lab, we're doing it in beaker and in a small container. And you can see it right now, they're using forklifts to put things into solution because these are done at near tonnage scale at this point in time. And this is where the pilot plant is being built. And this is the material after rare earths are leached from that. And eventually this will go for copper and aluminum and other recycling. We took this rare earth oxalate and converted it to oxide. And the company in the UK turned this oxide to metal. And again, showing that it can go back into the supply chain. And here are some of the benefits of this technology. 99 commercial grade rare earths and cobalt can be recovered. It's applicable to multiple feedstock. It's selective leaching, which eliminates pre-separation. As a result, CapEx and OpEx are reduced. It's operationally saved and environmentally benign, easily scaled. And recovered products are suitable to be used to make permanent magnets, and the byproducts are valuable. This is the technology maturation timeline, including the awards. Few days ago, we were told that we were selected for the 2023 Best in Mid-Continent Region Award for the technology. We have also received other awards before. I must acknowledge those who funded our work. I must say one thing before I end. Now, everything sounds good, but there is one problem. And that problem is, this is electronic waste. Where does it come from in the first place? It's not very economical to think that all electronic waste are going to be moved from Virginia to that one company in the Midwest. There will be pollution associated with that transportation. There will be cost. It's just not the best way to go. And we're trying to address this. One thing that happens when these electronic wastes are generated is that, remember what I told you about the CMI? We try to focus on where the e-waste that is concentrated. Hard drives are usually concentrated at data centers. So data centers, they pull a lot of hard drives. When you save something in a cloud, it's not hanging in the air, it's living in a hard drive that is in a data center. They decommission this a lot in a year. And the way they decommission it is that they have some companies that shred this hard drive to destroy the data. So eventually, we are going to get this from these companies. So what we have done is that we developed a modular processing unit, which is small footprint, that we stay at the point where these e-waste are generated. So generated, wash off the rare earth, they do whatever they used to do with the rest of it, and the rare earth is now concentrated. What this means is that instead of transporting it in a flatbed trailer, I can transport the rare earth in the trunk of a Toyota Corolla. And this means that the environmental impact is reduced. Thank you.
Thank you, Yana. Right. With that, the floor is now open to the audience for questions.
Sure.
In your presentation, you did mention cobalt as one of the crucial elements. Is there a reason why you didn't mention that, or
I was mostly focused on offshore wind. So, I mean, you have some level of cobalt in the permanent magnets, but, relative to some of the other elements. But no, cobalt is certainly if you look at the nickel manganese cobalt cathodes in stationary storage, which so far at Dominion, we haven't done a lot with stationary storage. We haven't had to. We're not over generating a lot at this point, but we will be ramping up probably close to certainly over a gigawatt of stationary storage over the next 10 years or so. But what we're seeing right now is sort of a trend in the stationary storage to really move towards like your lithium iron phosphate cathodes. So, but yeah, someone mentioned one of their presentations that I think it was you. That is one of the challenges with recycling right now is the dominant design of whether it's an EV battery or a stationary storage battery. There's new chemistries that come out every day. And so to plan on a recycling circuit is incredibly complex. But yeah, cobalt is certainly a challenge. I'm excited to see that here in the US, Idaho has a dedicated cobalt mine that should be commissioned hopefully soon, and that at least eases the pressure from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where 70% of this produce. But yeah, cobalt is certainly one of those very important critical minerals. Good question.
In all that you were talking about, clearly the solutions to many of these issues that you're talking are distributed around the world. So it's not just that the solutions are in one country, especially when you talk of mining of these rare metals and such. A big challenge in all of this is geopolitics. And geopolitics always comes in the way of prudent next steps. So how do you, I think education has a big role to play, but greed also has a big role to play. So how do you see all of that being balanced? And what are you seeing from a standpoint that you're in a for-profit entity versus those who are in academia? How do you balance this?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean,
Can I request that you use the mic?
oh, yeah.
Yeah, good question. I think it's a challenge. I don't think it's well understood. So, I mean, we've participated on some transatlantic, councils where we're talking with other, allied nations to the U.S. and trying to figure out, does it make sense for the U.S. to do all the mining and then the processing? And the answer is probably not. So I think it's making sure that it's well coordinated and that countries like Australia or Canada or Mexico that have the resources that we're well synced up and make sure we're leveraging their strengths versus our strengths. But I think at the end of the day, no matter what, we need to be more involved. I mean, the U.S. Is just not involved enough. I think for the 50 plus critical minerals, we import, over half, that we produce almost 0% of. And for that other 50%, we might produce maybe 15 to 20%. So, yeah, it's a complicated question. I don't know if you have anything you want to say.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very challenging thing to do. But there are already activities going on within the government. So, for an example, in the Critical Materials Institute, we, for 10 years now, have been collaborating with the Japanese in terms of developing technologies in this area. So we go to Japan one year, they come to the US the other year. So they came here this year, and next year is their time to host. And the plan is really to work together in this solution. And so that's a bilateral relationship. There is also a trilateral relationship. And the DOE has expanded that recently to include Australia, Canada, and other allied nations. There is another side to that coin. And I think it is for scientists like me who develop technologies. No matter what, one needs to remember that any technology you are developing needs to live in two types of ecosystem. One is the domestic ecosystem, but there is also the global ecosystem. In the domestic ecosystem, there's going to be, you might have some more friendly competition, but when you go to the global scale, it might be a little bit not as friendly as the domestic one. And the technology needs to be designed with that in mind. And I think if we do not do that, at the end of the day, we would be in a difficult situation to compete. You can educate anyone the much you can, but think about it. If you're running a company, are you going to pay additional $1 to buy something of $100? The answer is probably yes. It's $1, okay, versus $100. But what if it is $100 versus $250? Then everything changes. So you got to consider the sustainability of your own company. So technology development needs to put in mind the need to build in resiliency in sustaining the technology and the product of the technology.
I have a marshland question. So as the shoreline recedes, some new marsh is, takes over further back. The marsh that's underwater now is no longer sequestering carbon, but for how long is the carbon that's sequestered, for how long does it remain sequestered, and as opposed to being accessible to sea creatures, just, ending up carbon dioxide in the end? This one, it's on.
Maybe I do. Wait, okay, I got it. Yeah, so that's a really good question and something we're still trying to understand. So if the front edge of the marsh breaks apart and is eroded, then it can go on the surface of the marsh, in which case it actually gets returned to carbon dioxide really quickly. It can go through the estuary and be used by different plants and animals along the estuary pathway and get returned to carbon dioxide. It can go off the continental shelf and get buried, and then it's a permanent removal again. And so how much of each of those processes is happening, we're not actually really sure of yet. We don't have a good budget for it.
In enough time, it'll turn to coal. As you bury it. Yeah, exactly.
Question on your messaging guilt. Who's causing it? Can you give an example of how you would frame that when you're messaging?
I think you did a great example of that in your presentation about talking about, that this is not the fault of individual people making bad choices so much as it is policy that is causing these things. I think focusing on the policy as opposed to just individual, don't drink bottled water or something like that. The individual guilt is not going to solve the problem. And in fact, there's been some recent reporting about how fossil fuel companies like to guilt individuals because then it distracts from the bigger picture policy solutions. So, I think to acknowledge that, past generations have caused problems like climate change, but that we can be part of the solution now. Does that make sense?
Not individuals and maybe not the people, but the entity, the fossil fuel companies perhaps, or I don't know, the utilities perhaps being part of the problem. Do you locate blame on an entity rather than an individual?
Absolutely. I think for a lot of debates that getting into, there are cases like for offshore wind right now, that there's been some groups who are active in places like New Jersey and Massachusetts who are trying to claim, again, this is, whales are killed by ship strikes, by fishing line entanglement primarily. There have been some groups up there claiming that offshore wind is killing whales, and especially in some places where it doesn't even exist yet. I think you don't necessarily need to get too far into the details of why that's wrong to step back and say, there are groups that are funding this work that we need to talk about. Like, why are these groups and oceanfront landowners that never cared about whales before are suddenly claiming to speak for the whales? Talking about some of the real motivations there is a thing that we should be willing to go up to that level.
Just as a follow-up, there are skeptics who don't believe a word else. And those skeptics are the ones who elect politicians who make policies that is completely contrary to everything else that we want. How do you message to skeptics that what you are saying is really real? How do you make them believe?
And it's so hard to know, because you hear some of these politicians say that they're never going to support climate action, but then back home are great supporters of clean energy in their backyards. I think you need to know that there's going to be a certain percent of the population that you're never going to reach, that they've just decided culturally for them that they're just going to reject science. But I think focusing on, again, as I was saying, moving folks who are focusing on more like a Mitt Romney than a Donald Trump, somebody who might be more open to supporting some forms of action, and somebody who could get moved, more reasonably to support some policies. But fortunately for us, Tucker Carlson got fired this week, but those folks we're just never going to reach.
I just like to say the tide is turning. So another reason for optimism, the percentage of Americans who don't believe this is shrinking. And, we're winning this part of it. So, just we can't convince everyone, and just the more people who are convinced, the better we're doing.
I'm wondering, another way of trying to target those guys is to go to the children, K to 12, and perhaps educate them. And
That's why we're winning. That's why we're winning, because the age of the skeptics is way older than the age of the believers, and the skeptics won't be here as long as the believers.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to this too, I think what's important is follow through. I think it's generally intuitive to folks that the climate is changing. We are doing things about it. As I pointed out, Dominion, we're investing billions of dollars for it. But it's also important that as we're investing these dollars, that we're also providing affordable and reliable electricity. When at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how renewable it is when you're sitting at the hospital and the power goes out and your backup generator is not working because your battery's dead. So I think that there is a balance. And so as speaking from the industry, from the energy industry standpoint, we need to be methodical and make sure that when we're actually deploying these technologies, that we're actually able to follow through on what we're saying. There's still a lot that we're learning. I mean, you look at coastal Virginia offshore wind. I mean, our hope is, and the best science says, that we should be able to run that at 44% capacity factor. So what does that mean? I mean, that means that there's still going to be, 56% of the time that's not generating any energy. So what do we do? And so then all of a sudden, you might have a levelized cost of energy saying that 44% of the time it equals X, and we still have to put in transmission. We've got to figure out how are we going to do underwater batteries. Now there's companies out there who have big, concrete chambers that you fill these bladders full of water and pump them and empty them and spin turbines, but it is a lot of innovation. And so to me, that's also the exciting part. And that's where I think that I connect well with my students and with folks in the community, is talking about there's so many opportunities to be part of the solution. But at the end of the day, I can tell you, we talk to a lot of customers, they want reliability and they want affordability. Generally, cleanliness comes in third. And so we just have to keep that in mind.
With that in mind, can you comment about circular business models and how Dominion is investing in it?
Yeah, we're very focused on circular business models. I mean, we're absolutely exploring the recycling space. I was just talking with I think it was Professor Stephen Young. Yep, and we're one of the first, I think probably the first utility that's actually doing biomass carbon capture. We've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres where our compressor stations and power plants sit, and they grow weeds. So we're trying to figure out what's the maximum biomass that we can grow to capture as much carbon as possible. Put local farmers to work, convert it to biochar, and amend it into the soil. And so we're working on projects like that. So we are absolutely thinking about how can we be as circular as possible in everything that we're doing. And I think that we're making good progress in that front. So.
Can you repeat the question again? I understood it from his perspective.
So in terms of recycling and circular business model, you spoke a lot about life cycle assessment. How do you, and this is academia over here, how do you advise that each research group we incorporate life cycle, the thought process into our research projects? If you can put some thought into that.
Oh, that's a challenging question. Because when we think about circularity, we usually think about it from product perspective. But I think a different way to look at it is from institution perspective. So what would an institution like VCU or Ames Lab do in terms of sustainability? Right now, what we do, say in Ames Lab, is that some hard drives that we produce, we shred it, we recover rare earth from that. And a few months ago, a city of Nevada in Iowa heard about that. Their police department brought their hard drive to be shredded, and then they told another county, and it's going that way. And I think it's all about leading by example, trying to show that you are committed to what you're saying that you're doing. There are places you can't do that, obviously, but as much as you can, show the example. I remember in Iowa State Fair, standing in for Ames Lab, but talking about recycling, part of what we do is upcycling of plastics. So we take the plastics rather than allowing it to contaminate the environment, we upcycle it to other products that we may use. And when I use the plastic, and then when we use the plastic and we put it there, it resonated to people. People looked at it. What are these plastics for? And then when you tell the story, they understand what you're trying to do. So I think it's really to be conscientious about it, understanding that whatever we do has a consequence, and how can we minimize the negative impacts of the consequences?
Things that the critics of EVs always talk about is the batteries. What about when they're worn out? You know, what do you do with them? So recycling, Redwood Industries, that's all I ever hear. And I don't know, does that just?
Yeah, I'd like to comment, then I'm sure you have a lot to say. So Redwood is very successful because what they're doing, and this is not well known, is when you start up a gigafactory, in about the first 2 to 3 to 4 years, you've got about 20 to 40% of the material is actually wasted, because you have to have that lithium, the nickel, the cobalt, the manganese. It has to be so perfectly pure that if it's not and it contaminates the cell, then you can have all kinds of battery issues. So Redwood and these companies, they're taking advantage of that waste, which is great, and they're recycling it, and then they're putting it back into the battery manufacturing site. Now, from an EV battery perspective, realistically, you're probably 7 to 10 to 12 years away until you've got enough EV batteries that are ready to be recycled. But we're actually working on a project, and we'll hopefully be debuting this, where we're looking at an intermediate step. There is, the EV ends and you recycle the battery, but there's still about 60 to 70% of the power availability in that battery. So we've got a business line where we're actually repurposing and giving these batteries a second life for mobile battery generators. And so more to come on that. So I think that's a big space that's starting to grow, is, how can you take the 70% energy density left in those batteries and do something for another, say, 10 to 12 to 15 years at more of the stationary storage side.
Yeah, I think he really addressed that well. When a battery is not suitable for EV, that doesn't mean that it's not suitable for other applications. So it's really, how do you extend the life of that battery? That's from a societal perspective. But there is the other side of this coin. The owner of that battery, what does he do? Because now the battery needs to be replaced and it's not cheap. But eventually the battery is going to come to end of life. And what do we do? So Redwood is doing a good job so far, but there are emerging approaches. In my opinion, one of the challenges we have with batteries these days is really how we treat batteries at the end of life. Typically, what you do is that you discharge it and then you grind it. And then eventually you go through a pyrometallurgical processes, and then you use whatever you get, dilute, put it in solution, and then start separating one element after the other. The consequence of that is that efficiency is low. If you think of what I told you about the acid-free dissolution, what we try to do is to minimize pre-processing, because each pre-processing step you add, you've added two things: losses and extra cost. And if you minimize the pre-processing, then you can increase your efficiency. So there needs to be opportunities to recycle battery much better. We had this yesterday with most of the lithium not being recycled because it's very small, it's lost normally. We have a new process that's really coming on board. And what we're trying to do is to trick the battery, do what the battery likes to do. And one of the things the battery likes to do is that the lithium in a battery likes to plate. So when you hear sometimes thermal runaway batteries catch fire, it's really when the lithium grow dendritically, they puncture the electrolyte and eventually expose things and they have flame. So normally they like to plate. And what we're trying to do is to use that mechanism for recycling. And so close to the end of the life of battery, we identify situations that will allow the battery to plate maximally. And so we concentrate the lithium on the anode. And then the battery can then be disassembled. So when you pull the anode, which is graphite, you have most of your lithium there. And all you just need to do is to dip it in water and the lithium turns to lithium hydroxide. And once that's happening, you have hydrogen going out and you can capture the hydrogen. So we have shown that we could do this with lithium cobalt oxide battery. We pull most of the lithium to the anode. We pull the anode out. We dip it in water. We have lithium hydroxide in water. The anode is reusable because you dismantled, you can reuse your copper. You can reuse the rest of the materials in there. And we use the hydrogen that came up, we use it to produce ammonia to show that you could use that hydrogen again. Now we did this at a lab scale. It remains to be seen how we do it at a larger scale. But the proof of concept is there that this can be done. Nevertheless, I told you we dismantled. How do we accelerate dismantling of battery? This is where AI and machine learning comes into building the automation that is needed to do that. So we need to develop more efficient ways to, in terms of recycling, do this and make sure that we return it. Because once we do that, the whole thing is to make the price come down. And when the price comes down, then that's easier.
Thank you, Ikenna. It's 5:35 to stay in schedule. We conclude the panel. Much thanks to our panelists who have come down from as far as Iowa, Massachusetts, and our local panelists as well. So thank you very much for your time today. And so before we end with concluding remarks from Dr. Sriram Rao, Natasha Levinsky, and I would like to thank the students and the faculty for coming here. The students, particularly those who participated in the poster session. And with that, Natasha, would you like to announce the winners?
So first, I'd like to thank the two judges for our poster session, Dr. Everett Carpenter and Alan Jones from the local IEEE chapter. And I also like to thank the local IEEE chapter for sponsoring the student awards as well. So without further ado, our Best Poster Award. So first place for this inaugural 2023 ISEE Symposium is, and I apologize if is Vibhan Sharma.
Thank you. Thank you. You want to take? You have Anthony here too. All right.
First.
Try this. Sorry, one more. Oh, that was pretty good. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And our second place Best Poster Award goes to Arjun Patel. Thank you all again. And thank you for the wonderful poster presentations again as well.
All right.
Dr. Raj, you could please give them concluding remarks.
Hi, good evening. I'm just curious, how many of you are not from VCU here? I know the panel, except from my colleague, Michael Dannenberg. A few of you are from outside VCU. So welcome to those of you who traveled from all over to come to VCU for this inaugural symposium that was organized by the Institute for Sustainable Energy and Environments. And I want to thank the leadership group, and Dr. Jenna, Radhika, Atul, where he is, and Damien and others for putting this symposium together. What an amazing symposium that you did put together, and clearly trying to tackle some of the most important issues that we are, I think, societally facing today. And it really behooves us to kind of ask these questions in a manner where no single discipline can have the answers to all the solutions that are needed. So I apologize that I wasn't here for most of the symposium. And one of the reasons was I was in Washington, D.C. till, and I've just come back. And one of the questions that the reasons the question was prompted was, I was in a conversation with an ambassador of one of the countries out of Africa, where they are looking at truly exploiting the minerals that they have for future energy needs. And all I heard was the geopolitical issues of how they were going to leverage that to their best advantage, regardless of, it wasn't said so explicitly, but ultimately the economies of scale are going to drive a lot of these conversations. So these are challenging issues. On the same token, I was also in conversations with the other energy lab that we have here, Department of Energy funded, Jefferson Labs, which is in Newport News, where they are talking about harnessing the unknown areas within the atom, within the nucleus. We just barely know about these gluons and these quarks. But the energy that lies inside there that we haven't even harnessed and we hardly know anything. So through all this doom and gloom that we talk about, and there's plenty of that happening, what was so inspiring listening to you all was that there are potentially solutions that we as humans can come up with. And it's not without reason they say necessity is the mother of inventions. And this is truly one of those driving cases. So I think the solutions are coming from all over. And it is, I think, in that tremendous spirit where places like universities and academia are going to play a critical role in working with labs like yours and with government agencies. I mean, if we look at the value of research, and if research and science can't advocate and drive and change policy, what is the point of doing that research? If science and research can't make fundamental changes to the societies and uplift people, what is the point of doing all of that? So I think we at VCU, like many of our other colleagues across many other universities, are trying to embrace that concept that we have to address these fundamental issues by performing not only individual science where we have experts in different fields, but bring these people together so that the power of that transdisciplinary research is going to lead to the solutions that we need. And so I think it is in that spirit at VCU we have been also creating a lot of these transdisciplinary institutes. And one of those institutes is indeed the Institute for Sustainable Energy and Environments. And this is the inaugural conference. And it was so really nice to see that this inaugural conference was organized as part of, as VCU is celebrating its research weeks. And so this whole concept of research weeks evolved out of, so for those of you who are at VCU, you know, we've been hosting something called a research week, where we essentially take and celebrate what our undergraduate researchers do and our graduate researchers do. But we realize that there's so much that is happening in the realm of research across different spheres of our arts and science and social sciences and the STEM areas and in our health sciences. And we wanted to bring all of that together and truly celebrate that as a month-long event. And so it is under that environment that we are doing this. And so I'm really pleased at the kinds of things that you've all talked about, the questions that you have raised, and truly this inaugural symposium is not an end in all. It is just the beginning of many such conferences and collaborations and all of that are going to ensue from these discussions. I truly hope out of the symposium, you truly have made new connections and made new contacts and possibilities of collaborating, because ultimately the solutions have to come from these disparate kinds of people who are doing things and to bridge that. So I truly hope that happens. So I know I am the person that is holding you between the lovely little party that they plan to have there. So I want to take this time to tell you how pleased I am with everything that has come out of this conference. I've heard a little bit from him that it's gone extremely well. And so I want to thank you all for being here and look forward to seeing you all back at another symposium in the near future. And most importantly, I know this Institute for Sustainable Energy and Environments is going to be very critical as we look at all the fundamental issues. And we truly, the reason VCU is investing in institutes like this is because I think transformative innovation needs to happen through transdisciplinary research at institutes like this. So good luck to you all and good luck to everyone around here, and have a wonderful evening and look forward to seeing you soon.